It's really a great pleasure. I want to speak just for a second about the Jung Institute of San Francisco, because this event is one of those that we've designated as a donor cultivation event, not meaning that you have to do anything right now. You have the next few days. But we are very actively in the process of, after much internal work, of deciding who we are, and what we need, relocating which goes beyond simply the sale of this building. It also involves the renovation and the maintenance of the new building. So we're very interested in anyone who is also interested in us. So if you would like to contact me personally, I can give you a much longer set of reasons why you've called the right person. So one of the reasons this institute is worth supporting is that it puts on events like today's event. I had the privilege of being interviewed by Dick Russell for a very brief period in 2008 as he was beginning the process of collecting information about James Hillman. And as nearly as I can tell, since I was on the list, he must have spoken to absolutely everybody who had anything to contribute whatsoever. I was also given the chance to review his book, which is now the first volume has come out, The Life and Ideas of James Hillman, for a journal online called Academy Forum. You can actually find that 2014 issue of spring of 2014, in which my review appears. But I was really amazed to see what could be done by someone outside of the analytic field in biography. It's undoubtedly the finest biography I have read in the entire corpus of Jungian biography, which is a checkered field, I have to say. Because opinion usually and interpretation usually replace facts. And Dick brings the skills of an enormously differentiated journalist. I like to think of him as a sports writer, although that is only one of his many, many things, because he gives a blow-by-blow description of absolutely everything that happens. And you'll certainly in the first volume of The Life and Ideas of James Hillman, and none other than the editor of the Red Book, Sonu Shamdasani, who is probably the most critical of biographies of anyone, says, "Thankfully, this is not a psychological study. It eschews off-the-shelf interpretations or biographical reduction, while remaining attentive to the echo of past and future, rather than being presented with the author's take on his subject or an evaluation of Hillman's work. The biography presents thick description, drawn from interviews with the protagonists themselves, together with contemporary letters and documents." I have to tell you, if you know Sonu Shamdasani's work, this is extremely high praise, extremely high praise from the leading Jung historian in the world. Actually, he's a professor now at the University of London, and he's the editor of the Red Book, and his foreword is one of the great things. So Dick has covered everything from the backstory of the Kennedy assassination, which people are still catching up with some of the things he said there, to black artists in this country, and several studies of the environmental situation. including one fish story and one whale story that he's put together. So most recently, he's turned his own remarkable ability to document, learn, be empirical to probably the hardest story I could ever imagine anyone writing, which is the story of trying to understand his own son's alternative reality. And the title of this new book came out in December, sitting right here, is My Mysterious Son, a life-changing passage between schizophrenia and shamanism, in which he took a mixed-race son who had been diagnosed as schizophrenic, put in different hospitals, and eventually found someone of the West African shamanic tradition to do a different kind of amplification of his son's phenomenological experience. Pretty good for a non-analyst and amazing for a parent. So I want to say that I'm really privileged to introduce you, Dick, and I'm going to learn, as I always do when I read or encounter your work.
Thank you so much, John. That was a very heartwarming introduction, and I really appreciate it. It's great to be here in San Francisco and to see all of you. I came in yesterday from LA, where I live a lot of the time, and go back periodically to see my son, who is now 36 and lives in Boston. And I should mention, in terms of that book, which there are copies here, and I'll be happy to sign them afterwards to anyone who's interested, along with the Hillman biography. But the James was very helpful to me with my son, and I'll get into some of that a little bit later in a personal sense. But I want to start with, I'll be doing a lot of reading today from the book, so I hope that's not going to be boring to you. It's kind of different sections, and then I'll talk as I go along about what comes in between. And I'll probably take a break, maybe two. Standing for 3 hours is a little problematic, so as I'm getting older. So anyway, I'll do that at least one point. And I've never done a 3-hour lecture. I did a 6-hour one in Los Angeles, and I did an hour and a half here at the Institute for Integral Studies I don't know, a year and a half ago or something. So I've gone through the book again and marked passages, and I'm not exactly sure how the timing is going to work, but hopefully it'll work out okay. And I'll start with just a couple of connections, since this is the Jung Institute, and James Hillman, of course, knew Jung in the 1950s, and I'll be reading some of that later. But I was struck by some sort of synchronous things, which was that Hillman and Jung both died at the same age, which was 85. James died in October of 2011. Jung was 50 when Hillman was born, and when Hillman died, we were honoring the 50th anniversary of Jung's death. The 1972 Terry lectures that James Hillman gave at Yale were out of the same series that Jung gave in 1937, and they were the only two Jungians ever to give those lectures. And I'll be writing about the Terry lectures in volume 2 of the biography, which I have been working on. Again, I get sidetracked by other projects at different times because I've got to make a little bit of money, and this book, frankly, doesn't make a lot of money, but it reaches people, and that's been I've gotten some just wonderful responses from people to the first volume, and the second one also probably going to be another tome. I tend to write these long books, so I'm working on it. It'll probably come out, I don't know, in the next couple of years, I hope. But Hillman gave a talk called In Defense of Jung, A Soul Psychology for the 21st Century, when it was 2005, actually. It was 10 years ago now in Santa Barbara at Pacifica. And he described the reason why Jung is so unappreciated. And he said, you need an enormous capacity to grasp this huge man and his ideas. He was an extremely difficult person. He had a charismatic and terrorizing effect on people. He had great anger, rage. Jung asked new and heretical questions. It made it easier to put him in a box than to take the whole thing on because of the complexities you have to deal with. in his visions at the end of his life, he uses the phrase of getting outside the box. And I thought, when I heard Hillman say that in many ways, Hillman might have been describing himself. I'll get into more about that a little bit later. Now, I am not a therapist, and I did not major in psychology in college. I read Memories, Dreams, Reflections when I was traveling around the world when I was like 22 or so. And that had a huge impact on me. And I was struck looking back at some of my journals from those days that I kept when I was traveling, that I was reading a lot of Jung, and I'd actually forgotten I had. I read Psyche and Symbol, and Jung was a profound influence on me in those years. But I was a journalist. You know, I started off, I was a sports writer when I was young, and my first job was with Sports Illustrated magazine. When I was actually only 20, I got a job as an intern in New York, and then went to work full-time for SI after I graduated from the University of Kansas in 1969. So, you know, it was a whole nother realm. I then quit. It was the 60s, and I left that job behind after only 7 months and took off with a backpack and a portable typewriter and roamed around the world for a year and a half and never looked back, really. And then I freelanced in New York for a while when I got back, and then I worked for TV Guide magazine in Hollywood as a staff writer in the late 1970s, and did a lot of writing on the environment. My books are on the Kennedy assassination, as John said, the genius of African Americans, and following the migration of the gray whales, saving a fish called the striped bass, Atlantic striped bass. And then most recently, and a very different, it was funny because I was working on some of these books, on James's biography, and on books with the wrestler turned governor Jesse Ventura at the same time. And if you don't think those two voices are about 180 degrees apart, I mean, you know, because I wasn't a ghostwriter because my name was on the books with Ventura, but I met him in Mexico and ended up doing his memoir. So, you know, he kind of does to the English language, I don't know, it's diametrically opposed to James Hillman's erudition. But Ventura is a wonderful guy and very creative. And so you may rightfully wonder, though, how did I come to be the authorized biographer of James Hillman? A man who, for most of his years writing more than 20 books and translated into 21 languages, refused even to send a picture to his publishers, much less a biographical account. He gathered up quotes, in fact, in a folder that he labeled biography. And these quotes, I had some of these. He gave them to me one time when I was working on this. George Eliot calling biography a disease of English literature. W.H. Auden labeling it superfluous. James Joyce, who was one of the novelists that Hillman most admires, described biographers as biogafiends. And J.M. Barrie, who created Peter Pan, wished that, may God blast anyone who writes a biography of me. Freud, when he was 29, made a bonfire of his papers and said, as for the biographers, let them worry. I'm already looking forward to seeing them go astray. So this was kind of where Hillman was coming from in terms of biography. And so how did this come to pass? Well, it was in the mid-1990s. I live in a sort of large extended family, and we've been living together for a long time, and very interested in different kinds of subjects, esoteric subjects, and began reading Hillman's works, and even sitting down together and reading them aloud together sometimes. And I didn't know who James Hillman was. Of course, I knew who Jung was, as I said. But so I think the first book was Thought of the Heart, Soul of the World, and then my wife, who's much more psychological than I, gave me the Soul's Code to read, and so we've been discovering him. And then one day in the kitchen of our place in Boston, one of the kids who'd grown up in the family, we were talking about Hillman, and suddenly he says, my dad, his dad used to live with us and no longer did, and was an organic farmer in Connecticut. He says, my dad knows James Hillman. He sells him his organic vegetables in the market in Connecticut. So I called up my old friend Wayne, and I said, Wayne, you know James Hillman? I said, God, I'd love to meet him sometime. Do you think you could arrange? He says, well, he's a very private person, you know, I don't know that I can do that. And so, but anyway, so I sent a copy of my book, Black Genius, about the genius of African Americans, and a lot about relationships and how the importance of mentoring and family in the African American tradition. I sent it for Wayne to give to James, and he did, and James read it and found it interesting, and we ended up having a lunch together in Connecticut, my wife and I and Wayne, and we had a really great time. We spent a couple hours drinking beer together, and we traded tales about Africa, where I'd been and Hillman had been, and we both traveled there. And it turned out that James, as we had at the time, also raised chickens and said that they inspired him. He said they're real psychology majors. I asked him his birthday and found out that he was an Aries. And he asked me my sign, and I told him I was a Leo. He said, oh, that's just as bad. And at the end of that day, he signed a copy of my copy of the Soul's Code at a first meeting before the next. So a couple of years go by. This was late 90s. And then we had a dinner in the same pub where we'd met in Putnam, Connecticut, and Wayne came again and it was the first time I'd met James's wife, Margot. And we had this wide-ranging conversation. I mean, just James could talk about any subject and you know, bring something to it, as I'm sure you know. So we talked about movies and whales and Italy and the environment, and they were trying to stop this big sewer line project at the time, so I put him in touch with a friend at the EPA, and I gave him a copy of another hefty book, 600 and some pages, called Eye of the Whale. My first book had weighed in at 824 pages. It was called The Man Who Knew Too Much, but friends called it The Book That Grew Too Much. So Margot asked, do you write in the morning? And James said, no, he writes all day. Well, I didn't actually write all day. But so he inscribed our copy then of In Search. After beer and meat, you don't need psychology. So we'd also talked about this extended family that I've lived as part of for a long time. And then James and Margot came and stayed with us for a few days in LA in 2002. And somehow I remember we got talking about his driving, and he said, I'm not a bad driver, I'm just not good at steering. So he didn't do any more driving. I mean, he knew how to drive, but Margot drove during that period. So I noticed how observant he was about everything, you know, as a yellow kind of bougainvillea that he'd never seen before, and telling me when our cat Dexter meowed hello to him, goodbye to him, he said, not all cats talk, you know. And I remember him saying, this was after 9/11, he said that the towers haven't really fallen yet. We've not yet reached the bottom. And in an America so far removed from its shadow side, he spoke about fear being the prime motivating factor. Later he asked me, he said, what do you do on a sinking ship? Do you pray? So James and I spent some wonderful time together talking about how he came to write about psychology, and at one point my wife asked him about his relationship with Jung, and he said he didn't really study under Jung, but he did a couple of seminars with him, as well as having a couple of long private conversations at Jung's house in the 1950s. And so we asked, what was it like being with Jung? And he said, it was like being too close to the sun. Jung had such an amazing presence and seemed so big, but of course James was young. And he said with Jung you didn't say much, you just listened. And later I'll read you some of about their relationship from the book, which I found fascinating. So then we visited their home in Connecticut over the holidays and met their cats, and it was this beautiful old farmhouse surrounded by oaks and maples and a single birch tree. And he was working on a new book, but he didn't want to tell us what it was about. He was very, very private about this. Turned out to be a terrible love of war, which he finally told us. But then and later we talked politics and history, and even found a common interest in boxing. Back on the radio when he was a boy, he'd listened to Joe Louis and all the great fights, and they also loved old black and white movies, and so did I. So we took turns tossing lines at each other from on the waterfront. James says, I could have been a contender. And I said, quit breathing that clam sauce on me. And so it went like that. I don't know if you remember On the Waterfront. And they visited us in Boston. We'd go to Connecticut and conferences at Pacifica when we were out in California. And then it was Christmas, I guess, of 2003, and I met his sister, older sister, Sue. He had 3 siblings, two sisters and a brother. And she happened to be there visiting, and she was a wonderful storyteller and told a lot of stories about the family, and which led me to suggest to James that you know, someone get her memories on tape while she was still with us. And so this gave him the idea to have a gathering at his home that summer of June of 2004 and bring together his siblings and as many of his children. I think they were all there. Well, Lawrence wasn't there, but the girls, we weren't girls anymore, were there with their kids, and all get together. And I had a young friend who was a filmmaker, and she came and filmed the weekend, and it was just wonderful. All these reminiscences about Atlantic City and when he was growing up, and I was sort of the reporter, so you know, I ended up asking a lot of the questions and as the filming was happening. And then his friend happened to show up, this wonderful guy named Kenny Donahue, who had lived in Ireland for many years, and he just happened to be around. I don't know, he came over, and they had remarkable banter between them. And then, so that's really how, then after this, it was the summer of '04, and James had never really wanted to have a biography done, didn't want to write an autobiography, but I think it was our wives got talking about it and whether he was ever going to do this. And I spoke to him on the phone later that summer, and he asked if I wanted to do it. And it was kind of daunting. I mean, you know, as I say, I'm certainly not an expert in this field, but I think that's what he wanted. He wanted somebody who didn't have any axe to grind or any real, you know, I just went out and we went to Ireland together the next year, my wife and I, and he and Margot, and we traveled around and stayed with J.P. Dunleavy, the famous novelist who wrote The Ginger Man, who Hillman had gone to school with at Trinity College in Dublin, and they'd remained great friends all these years. And so I interviewed Dunleavy, and we went to see Kenny and just traveled around and had this incredible time together. So, you know, and so we were, it emerged really out of a friendship. I mean, James was 21, he was 21 years older than I. And you know, but we agreed early on that this was not going to be a what do you call it, hagiography, you know, like you're just writing all the wonderful stuff about somebody, that we should get into the difficult parts of his life, the crises that he'd been through. And so I just set out to find all these people and talk to them about him. And I started actually by going through material at his home, because it turned out there was a trove. I mean, he had a whole, you know, box after box of stuff on his ancestors who were quite illustrious, and I'll get into some of that too. And then there were all these letters, like his mother had saved all the letters that he had written home from the period. He started like in 1943, so he was born in 26, so he was like 17. And then through 1953, almost his entire life was chronicled in these long epistles that he would write to his family. And so, you know, for the formative years, I mean, a biographer couldn't ask for more than that. I mean, you know, especially when you're trying to write about how somebody came to be who they were. And then it turned out that so many of his friends and colleagues had also saved the letters that he sent. Dunleavy had all his letters. I mean, and so it was this kind of amazing thing that I was photocopying letters from people no matter where I went. And then there was this guy named Wesley Hyler, Wesley Eugene Hyler, and James said, well, he was his bunkmate in the Navy in 1944. And you know, James was in the top bunk, and Hyler, who was shorter, was in the bottom bunk, and they became great friends. And Hyler later became a prison psychologist, although neither one of them were planning to be psychologists at that time. And James said, well, you know, he might still be alive. And so, you know, these days you can do internet searches, and so I set out to find him, and I found this guy Eugene Hyler somewhere in Oregon, who seemed about the same age. And James said, because I don't think James had told me his middle name yet, and so he said, yeah, that's it. So call him up. So I did. And I called this number thinking maybe it was the right guy. And a woman answered. And I told her what I was doing. I was doing this biography of James Hillman. And she said, yes, well, that's Wes. And so she put him on the phone. And so I told him that I'd like to interview him sometime about Hillman. And he said, well, let's just start right now. So I wasn't really prepared. I didn't have questions or anything yet. I said, okay. So, you know, I sat there in front of my computer, and the first thing he did was he started by telling me 2 dirty jokes that he remembered that Hillman had told him in 1944, which was pretty amazing in itself. I'm not going to tell. I can't. They don't immediately spring to mind. But anyway, so at the end of that conversation, Hyler, says, well, he says, you know, I might have some letters. I said, oh, well, that would be fabulous. You know, could you look and see? And so I expected maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 letters that maybe he'd dig up. And a week or so later, in my mail box arrives this box of letters. There were like 50-some letters that Hillman had written to him, and he sent me the originals. I mean, it was like, wow, you know, this is amazing. And of course, they were very different than the letters he'd written to his parents. I mean, they got into some pretty juicy stuff about, you know, that he was all these letters in the late 1940s. So, I mean, I was very blessed, lucky to have these people that, and then then Hyler says, let's see, he was a prison psychologist, and it turns out that he was, among others, at Vacaville Prison in California. I think it's near here. He was Charlie Manson's psychiatrist, which was, and he said, oh, and I have all these letters from Charlie Manson. Do you want them? Of course, I told this to James, and he says, well, that's your next book. And I said, well, I don't know about that, but I did end up with those letters. And yeah, I went to interview Hyler at his home. He's passed now, but he ends up, you know, sending me over to his nephew's place, who had all this whole bunch of letters from Charlie Manson. So, and the nephew didn't want to give them up because they were worth something, I think, or he thought they were. So anyway, but I've never written a book on Charlie Manson and don't intend to, but that was pretty amazing too. So, you know, when I started out working on the book, 2004, James said to me, he said, I hope you're not looking at this as a fast book. He said, this will take years, you know. And well, he was right, and he hoped that I would work on other projects at the same time, and I did, and I will get into later what the help that he gave me, you know, personally with my son, yeah, I started off when I told this story in Pittsburgh. I started off writing. I thought, well, I've always, all my life, I'm a very informal guy, and I had always used my nickname. My full name is obviously Richard Russell. But I'd always written under Dick, and you know, basically, I thought, well, should I change my name at this point because I'm writing about James Hillman, and should I become a Richard? But I've always written these books, and I've been a Dick all my life, so you know, I figured that was okay. And in fact, there was one when I was in and maybe it's because of this that I clung to the name. I don't know, but in grade school, I remember one day going by my grade school and seeing all these things written on the sidewalk, and I was like, I don't know, 8 years old, and I remember being kind of horrified, and I went running over to the principal's house. His name was Mr. Shirk, and I knocked on his door. It was a weekend, and Mr. Shirk came to the door, and I said, Mr. Shirk, I just got to tell you that somebody wrote all these dirty words on the sidewalk in front of the school, and they signed my name to it. So I don't know, it's some kind of complex or something. But at any rate, I'm going to do some reading now from the book. As I say, I've never, well, I'll read a little bit from the introduction. I'll skip around a bit. From James Hillman's perspective, I'll start with this. The author of more than 25 books, James Hillman was the founder of what he called archetypal psychology, a way to reimagine the field and also to differentiate it from the analytical psychology of C.G. Jung. Hillman's work has been translated into 21 languages, and he lectured widely both across the United States and abroad. He was a practicing analyst for 40 years. Yet today, Hillman is rarely mentioned in the psychology departments of most American universities. While his name remains synonymous with deep thought in countries like Italy, Japan, and Brazil, here in his native land, a newspaper profile in 2004 was headlined, "The Wisest Man You've Probably Never Heard of." Such relative lack of recognition is because Hillman was among the most aggressive critics of his own profession. "We approach people the same way we approach our cars," he once said. "We take the poor kid to a doctor and ask, 'What's wrong with him? How much will it cost? And when can I pick him up?' We can't change anything until we get some fresh ideas so that we can see the same old problems differently." From James Hillman's perspective, the medical model has captured and corrupted psychology and diverted it from its true aim of understanding the psyche or soul. His emphasis on deeper appreciation of the sum of one's parts and our relationship to the larger world is a direct challenge to the field's core conventions, from the pharmaceutical and scientifically based cognitive impairment side of things to the pop psychology of a Dr. Phil with his self-improvement strategies. While Americans in general, and American psychology specifically, favor solution-based methods, Hillman does not attempt to provide conclusive answers. He doesn't focus on seeking integration and unity, but rather on examining the unique and particular qualities that comprise our diversity. Hillman's psychology offers many variations on a theme that harkens back to the Renaissance and the ancient Greeks, implying that psychology belongs more to the arts and humanities than to science. For his emphasis on the Renaissance philosophers of the soul, Hillman was awarded Italy's Medal of the Presidency in 2001. Traversing a path that Freud and Jung first began to explore, he returned the gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus to the heart of psychology, examining how ancient myths can provide insight for today's issues. In what has been termed a polytheistic psychology, there is no need to get it all together in therapy. Rather, the point is to recognize the tension between timeless archetypal forces at work within and around us. If true psychology emphasizes the fundamental fantasies that animate all life, then gods and goddesses as embodiments of these fantasies can amplify and deepen our own experience. Hillman's approach takes psychology back to its ancient origins, where the word literally means study of the soul, deriving from the Greek psyche. For Hillman, soul is not a substance, but a perspective, an inner place that is simply there, even when all our subjectivity, ego, and consciousness go into eclipse. It is also the imaginative possibility in our natures, that unknown component which makes meaning possible, turns events into experiences, is communicated in love, and has a religious concern. He is not speaking of religion in the conventional sense, believing rather that this soul spark exists not only in people, but in animals, plants, even architecture. While most contemporary therapists pay foremost attention to the psychology of the individual, Hillman asks us to also look at the ways soul manifests in the environment and the world. Psychoanalysis has got to get out of the consulting room, he has said. You have to see that the buildings are anorexic, that the language is schizogenic, that medicine and business are paranoid. He's called for therapists to see patients not simply as ego-driven and chained to what happened to them earlier in life, but as citizens who must actively observe and participate in the world around them. Leaving the world more beautiful than we found it requires that we go beyond ecology to draw from aesthetics, and by extension, psychology. It is precisely this sort of activity that connects us with soul, while at the same time drawing us into political engagement. At the heart of Hillman's psychology was an effort to restore imagination. His work not only spoke of imagination, they spoke to it, embodying ideas and images with incisive intellect, wit, and passion. The subjects that he took up ranged from academic to artistic, philosophical to pathological, He brought fresh perspective to war, beauty, architecture, depression, suicide, masturbation, mythology, nightmares, and more. In so doing, he laid down a challenge to our deeply rooted heroic fantasies and values, asking us to question the value of an ego that insists upon being master in his own house and who always seeks to go it alone. In therapy, while often the focus is on early childhood trauma, and Hillman did not deny how devastating certain conditions of childhood can be, he also regarded the wounds of childhood as potentially soul-making experiences. These could connect the young person to an underworld that resonates with a sense of meaning and community. Hillman saw our dark moods and agonies, the things that interfere with the smooth running of our lives, as essential experiences not to be overcome or avoided. Therapy ought rather to respect symptoms and neuroses not simply as a suffering, but as an opportunity, asking what message might the symptom be trying to relay. However, in today's psychology, depression had become a big, empty, vapid jargon word, a terrible impoverishment of the actual experience. Describing how he might respond to a patient complaining of depression, Hillman once said, "I want to get precise. What do you feel? Sad, empty, dry, burned out? Do you feel weak? Do you feel like crying? And where do you feel depressed? In your eyes? Do you want to cry? Do you cry? In your legs? Are they heavy? Can't get up? Can't move? In your chest? Are you anxious? And how does that feel? Where? When? Is it like being tied up or being poisoned?" In other words, he would lead the patient into the realm of imagination, seeking to render lived experience in images. Hillman said in 2009, "The great question of biography is what Henry James called the figure in the carpet. How to discern a definite pattern, a comprehensible figure." During my numerous meetings with Hillman, he continually sought to offer a wider perspective in search of that figure. It is, of course, unusual for a biographer to work closely with his subject as something other than a collaborative ghostwriter. There's a risk that the account will be a hagiography, too adulatory, omitting important details that the individual being profiled would just as soon not see brought forward. Hillman and I quickly established, however, that difficult and painful periods of his life should not be glossed over, including a scandal in the 1960s that rocked the Jungian world, which I'll get into a little bit later. Yeah, we spent a lot of time together. I mean, the way it worked was I would, not in the beginning, of course, because I hadn't written anything yet, but I would, as I would write a chapter, and the chapters tended to be fairly long in themselves, covering, and I didn't do it chronologically per se. In fact, I didn't intend to write 2 volumes. It became 2 volumes toward the end of his life when James was dying. I knew he wouldn't be around that much longer, and there was still a considerable parts of the book that I had not put together yet, and it was getting long. The book was getting really long, and I thought, you know, I'm just going to divide it into 2 parts. The first half would cover the first half of his life, and stop in the late 1960s, and then volume 2 would go on from there. And I had written some of what now will be volume 2 already, and he had read those chapters. I would give him the chapters as I went along, and he wouldn't really tell me to leave things out. He would just amplify them. So it was marvelous. We would sit and, you know, he'd read a chapter, and we'd get together the next time, and God, it was fantastic. You know, he would then take off on those subjects and add things to it, and then I would go back and do a second draft. And so he did read and comment upon everything in this book. But as I say, he didn't, and some of it wasn't easy. You know, there were parts of it that it took a long time for him to be able to talk about, and we'll get to some of that a little bit later too. But that's kind of how it went, and then it got deeper as we went along. I mean, he became also more challenging in terms of what he wanted. I'm basically a reporter. You know, I go out and I talk to as many people as I can find about a subject, and Then I sort it out. I tape my interviews, and as I did with him, and, and then I go back and I transcribe the tapes, and then I start to make some kind of sense out of it all. And I've got, you know, it's a technique. I mean, I've gotten to be pretty good at it over the years. And but there came a point. At one point, he was very challenging. He was saying, you know, I think you're always going out. You're always adding new material. And he felt like it was time I needed to kind of take it all in and do some digestion. And I did, you know, and still am, because the second half of his life that's when he was writing everything, and for the most part, and you know, and getting in, and archetypal psychology was really being born, so there's a lot there to cover, and of course different relationships. He had 3 wives. This book is a lot about Kate, his first wife, and second book there'll be a lot about Pat Berry. I'm sure some of you know who she is, and she's a wonderful person. I've interviewed her several times. Anyway, that's sort of a little bit of background on this, but the book then really starts here with his early years in Atlantic City. And Atlantic City was just an amazing place for him to grow up. He was born his parents were hoteliers, and so he was born in a hotel room. Called the Breakers in 1926, April 1926, and looking out at the sea. And in fact, it's where the younger Hillmans resided whenever there were renovations being done on their home. And Jewish family, but his mother Madeline, who was the daughter of this famous rabbi who died 3 years before James was born, named Joseph Krauskopf. She says, how lovely to have a blonde boy with blue eyes. She was very excited about this. So, and you know, but in those days, his arrival, his birth was announced in the Atlantic City press, including a photo of his mother, who was a very formidable figure in her own right, receiving congratulations with a fur stole draped around her neck above a set of pearls. And so Hillman in the Soul's Code would write that the self starts off amid the smells of a geography. And elsewhere, he would link that geography to the way that he approached his work. He said once, there is not a systematic meta-theory behind my thought. I come from New Jersey, where we have seagulls who fly right down and get what they want from the ocean side. I'm like them, dropping down into the depths of our culture and seizing what I need to understand things and make a point. In one of his lectures, Hillman would recall the disembodied feeling of the barrier island that contained Atlantic City. This was a place with no soil, no roots. By the way, Hillman had no earth in his chart, his astrological chart, nor do I. There was a place with no soil, no roots, where all the dirt for people's gardens had to be trucked in from the mainland. The highest point on the sandbar is 10 feet above sea level. You can be wiped out by one wave, he remembered. So he says his mother later had the idea when he was born. He spent his first 6 months taking in the bright sunshine of Atlantic City's high season, overlooking the ocean in his baby carriage from the lower balcony of this U-shaped hotel. He says, my mother later had the idea she put me too much in the sun, and that's why I had glasses from a very early age. But what he and his siblings absorbed of Atlantic City was incredible. The amusement piers, the circus-like arenas built out into the Atlantic Ocean for as far as half a mile were vast fantasyscapes, where tens of thousands might visit on a single summer day. A constant hullabaloo rose up from the beaches and the boardwalk, described in the prose of the day as a sweep of color, a riot of sound, and chaos of movement in this wildly extroverted place. The range of imaginative possibilities must have been stunning. An article in the New Republic stated in 1920, if you would know the best that the American bourgeoisie has thus far been able to dream, then come to Atlantic City and behold. By that time, Atlantic City had proclaimed itself the world's playground, and it was a place of many American firsts. The Easter Parade and the Ferris wheel were introduced here. Color views of the skyline graced America's first picture postcards. The term airport was coined to name Atlantic City's flying field. The convention hall was the largest auditorium ever built without interior roof posts or pillars, and it hosted the world's biggest pipe organ. Steeplechase Pier had the world's most substantial electric sign, 27,000 light bulbs that advertised Chesterfield cigarettes. The world's largest typewriter was viewable on Garden Pier, an Underwood that stood 18 feet high and weighed 14 tons. It worked perfectly, although someone had to physically sit on each 45-pound letter key to make it type. So this was a geography of exaggeration. The boardwalk fronted the world's largest assemblage of luxury oceanfront hotels, each with its own uniquely lavish character. The Traymore was a 14-story twin mosaic tilt-domed structure. The Queen Anne-styled Marlborough, named after the domicile of the Prince of Wales, had merged with the Spanish Moorish Blenheim with its extravagant dome and steamship-like smokestacks. Years later, Hillman mused over the hotel's European architecture and whether this may have subconsciously influenced his own distrust of progress. "There is an archaicism in my work," he said. "Anything new was suspect. It had to pass the test of time." When James Hillman was around 7, his older brother Joel would put him on his shoulders so that James could see and breathe in the midst of the teeming boardwalk crowds. Images would embed themselves in streams of consciousness. Midgets, snake charmers, and giants, adult female Siamese twins joined at the hip, fantastic fat people and incubated babies, fighting kangaroos, dancing tigers, and Professor Nelson's boxing cats, Rex, the water skiing dog, and chickens that could hit baseballs. Also on the wondrous piers, Harry Houdini made himself disappear, and Shipwreck Kelly set a world's record for sitting on top of a flagpole for 49 days and 1 hour. "You'd want to look at the flagpole sitters," Hillman would recall. "How did they stay up there?" And for us kids, it was, how did they go to the toilet up there? Polar explorer Richard Byrd showed up with his husky dogs pulling their sleds. One of them bit James's brother, Joel. So here were taffy pulls and giveaway pickles from H.K. Heinz and free nuts from Mr. Peanut and the Japanese tea garden and the authentic Hawaiian village. Here was the FBI booth with the counterfeit money John Dillinger used. Here too was the phenomenon of the rolling chairs. Dating back to 1887, the concept had emerged when invalids coming for the sea air would utilize small cane wheelchairs to get around the streets. These had evolved into white wicker rolling chairs with steel wheels and room for as many as 3 passengers. Like baby buggies for grown-ups under bearskins, pushed by quietly considerate old black men, Hillman would describe them more than 60 years later. The most popular boardwalk attraction was the high-diving horse. As many as 6 times a day, carrying on its back a scantily clad young lady in circus sequins, the horse would leap 40 feet from a wooden tower into a pool of water. The lovely Sonora Webster Carver was a featured rider. Because of the water's impact striking her face, she suffered detached retinas and soon became completely blind. Keeping her blindness a secret, after a few months' adjustment, she resumed riding and continued in her role for another 8 years. In her 80s, she would tell an interviewer, "It was a wonderful thing to do, a wonderful time to be alive in the greatest city on the earth." Out of the edge of $1 Million Pier, every hour a barker would beckon the crowds to gather around what was apparently a trap door to witness the deep sea net hauls. These especially fascinated young James. They'd let a gigantic net down to the bottom of the sea and then drag the net up with pulleys with the most crazy looking fish you ever saw: crabs, clams, eels, flatfish, everything. That interested me more than the diving horse on the steel pier, more than the freaks on the boardwalk. One historian relates that nearby snack vendors would time their preparations so that their tempting aromas of fried, steamed, or stewed seafood would waft over the crowd just as the net was dropped back into the briny deep. To Hillman, however, what mattered most was imagining what went on in that dark undersea world. He was also intrigued by the steel bathysphere in which deep-sea divers wearing giant helmets and giant shoes would immerse themselves. What if, like the hero in Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, they got their foot caught in a giant clam and were never able to surface again? One day, his older brother showed James how to sneak under the tent where Ringling Brothers was setting up. Years later, Hillman would write in The Dream in the Underworld in 1979, "Where else but the circus will we ever see the underworld in daylight. The tent of enclosed space, the rings, everyone as close to death as his or her art will allow, the freaks of nature that are beyond nature, and above all, the precise performance of repetitive nonsense, as if Ision, Tantalus, and Sisyphus had once worked for Ringling Brothers. The circus's high-diving Hawaiians also wore big steel helmets and plunged straight into the Atlantic from tall towers. For James, this was the primary image that would linger along with the questions. How long could they hold their breath? What about getting the bends? While showing much interest from a distance, the boy shied away from the water itself. My mother years later reminded me, Hillman said, that I used to scream like crazy stepping into a pond where my foot would touch squishy mud in the summer and I couldn't see the bottom. I was also afraid of the ocean. As a little kid, I remember being caught in an undertow and turned upside down. I didn't learn how to swim until I was about 14 years old. The one recurring dream that he would remember from childhood was watching in awe as a tidal wave approached from offshore. So you can kind of get a picture of what growing up in Atlantic City, how that fueled the imagination that he came to feel was absolutely crucial to psychology, therapy. Hillman would be in his mid-20s when, in the early stages of embarking on a Jungian analysis in Zurich, he began the experience of what Jung had termed active imagination. One of the most important moments, he said, was that I pictured myself going down into the sea and realized that I could breathe underwater. In other words, the fear of being submerged was gone. In 1988, addressing a gathering of men in the woods of Mendocino, California, I met a gentleman here today who was at these gatherings, Hillman revealed, in my own life, the terribly needy little boy is always there. And when I get massaged, for example, he lives in my arms. I always feel the puniness in there. When those places are touched, I feel that little tiny boy with his thin little neck on the New Jersey beaches where I grew up, trying to keep his head on, unable to hold that head, which these weak arms that couldn't do it. It's absolutely crucial that we remember neediness, puniness like that. I mean, you don't need to remember it because it comes up and grabs you and pulls you down. Now, as I said, his parents owned 2 hotels in Atlantic City. They also, I mean, they were very big in this entertainment world that Atlantic City represented. Well, first his grandfather had a restaurant in Washington D.C. called Harvey's. He bought, where all the bigwigs in Washington went, as far back as Abraham Lincoln and some of his people. And then the grandfather, Joel Hillman, also bought the Breakers Hotel. It actually had a different name first. It was called the Rudolph. Then he had the Breakers, and then the family later had another hotel in Atlantic City called the Chelsea, and a hotel in Paris, the famous Georges V, which they purchased in 1927. And so this is the world that Hillman grew up in, and it was a pretty incredible world. I'm going to just talk about this one part from this hotel. The Depression came along, of course, and it was in the Depression in the 1930s that they lost everything for a while. And his father had to go to work in a pharmacy, a drugstore. His mother had an antique business in Atlantic City and would travel regularly to Paris and get her antiques. And she was quite a formidable presence. And they also had in the 20s and 30s all these people coming to the house, who would come through Atlantic City. I mean, there's a picture in the book of his father greeting Lindbergh at the airport after the Spirit of St. Louis came back. They had this adventure writer, Richard Halliburton, who James always remembered and kind of tried to emulate in some ways. And then James was very influenced by the hotel world. So I'll read this one little passage. After school, James often did not go straight home, but rather to the Chelsea. One level below the lobby, the hotel had its own underground city. As he remembered, Being very old and having 400 rooms, the hotel needed constant reupholstering, redecoration, repainting, repairing, replastering, and repiping. The fact that you could have running salt water in your bathtub in parts of the hotel was, of course, terrible for the plumbing. All the windows and drawers stuck because of the sea air, so all the workers were constantly engaged in keeping this old ship running. It was like an oriental bazaar or around a cathedral, all the little stalls with a man in there doing his specialty. Hillman found it fascinating. His father didn't like him going down there and disturbing the men, but to the boy, this was the ultimate playground, an underground realm that fired his imagination. What the working people do, he said, is fascinating because they handle things, make things, and come from odd places like Poland or Ireland. So one's experience of life and people is immediately extended beyond the confines of the known family. It's like the unconscious realm of the psyche in a way, although the boardwalk and the steel pier were surely the freaky unconscious as well. Perhaps the underside of the hotel was more an early expression of my wanting to be in touch with the real America, into which, as an intellectual and a Jew, and not being very big physically, I did not quite fit, and which I made a big attempt to find later in the Navy and then working with men's groups in the 80s and 90s. So his interest in that kind of life really began in the underbelly, really, of that hotel. But there was also this psychology, sort of beginning to develop very young. His first known poem, James wrote in the 3rd grade, and it appeared in this gift book that he and his classmates made for their parents. All the other kids wrote simple poems about snow or flowers or ice cream, and this is what James wrote. He called it Colored Leaves. When I go to bed at night, and the door is shut and tight, and the shades are far down, the closet door seems to frown. Then I look upon the wall, and I see faces, fat and tall. Then they all seem to jumble, and into dreamland I stumble. So you can kind of see the future psychologist beginning to emerge out of that marvelous little dream. So I think I'll skip that part. Yeah, this was finally, Hillman wrote this. I'll summarize Atlantic City with this because he wanted to do he never wrote this book per se, but he in later years, of course, his writings would often focus on splitting and schism and the divided heart, as he called it, the sense of shadow following all brightness and pleasure and fun. And the origin of this idea was surely Atlantic City. He wrote in a proposal once for a book that never came to be. Could this place, where fate first deposited me for my first breath of healthy sea air, be the very key to the American character? Not Puritan New England, not Southern Cavaliers, slavery, and Bible Belt hillbilly, not gun-toting Wild West, not immigrant Lower East Side, nor Chicago, hog butcher to the world and the great farmlands and plains it drew from, not even California. Atlantic City, the root of not just Las Vegas, but the entire entertainment attitude of the American people. Atlantic cities have sprung up everywhere. Disneyland, Six Flags, Las Vegas, cruise ships, water parks. Isn't Florida, Hollywood, and most of Southern California Atlantic City writ large? Aren't the Golden Arches with gimmicky giveaways today's world's playground, as they call Atlantic City? The variety show of TV programming, the hucksters selling health, appraising antiques, home shopping like boardwalk auctioneers, the prize money shows, we had our $1 Million Pier, the animal photography and instruction, we had our deep sea net hall, the sexy romance and soap channels, the preachers, comedians, MTV, striptease, porn, criminals. TV is Atlantic City behind glass. The world itself a playground, never closing down day or night, entertainment forever. Today's America begins in my hometown. Now, in old age, I can see why I had to be born there and leave there for most of my adult life and emigrate to gain a different I. But in old age, we do go home again. Why? To connect one's own character with the origin of one's origin, one's place, and people. And I must say that the origin, the ancestors, in indigenous cultures, as I've come to learn much more about in recent years, the ancestors are extremely important. I've actually curiously, since James's death, I myself ended up going to a beach in Malibu to do a water ritual on behalf of my son, you know, invoking the water spirit, pouring libations into the, you know, here I was all alone on this beach in my mid-60s, this, you know, crazy white guy walking along and, you know, pouring in libations of, of organic milk and apple cider vinegar, and then vodka, a little shot of vodka, and finally walking along the beach and picking off these little kernels of corn and putting them in the water. So I've come to realize the importance of that. But James always had that, not, he didn't do that, but that kind of sense of his, of where he came from. And he traced it all back, you know, on the wall of the upstairs guest room where I would stay sometimes in his house. The walls were covered with pictures of his ancestors going all the way back, you know, 4 or 5 generations. So I'm going to read you a little bit about why this was so significant to him. And I started this long chapter. They wanted a chart which is called Family Callings, and I'll show it to you. This is the family tree, you know, that they drew up and really wanted in the book. And I started this chapter on his ancestors with a quote from Robert Graves: "Blow on a dead man's embers, and a live flame will start." In the first place, there was what James Hillman described as his martial nature, writing from anger, being quick to express rage at thoughtless questions during his lectures. He certainly did not look the part of a military man, although many would remark on his eagle or hawk-like countenance. Yet the traits were somehow inherent. His ease in giving orders, eventually being in charge of a psychological institute and then a publishing company. He could be so militant that his second wife, Patricia Barry, used to call him the Greek colonel. As Hillman wrote in his book, A Terrible Love of War, "Writing books for me is anyway much like a military campaign. I confess to fighting my way through with military metaphors. There's a strategy, an overall concept, and there are tactics along the way. Tradition would say I was a child of Mars." So where did it come from? Might this trait of character be an echo of Emanuel Lully, the great-great-grandfather, who was among the leaders of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848? Could it relate somehow to Rabbi Joseph Krauskopf, the grandfather who encountered Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War? Or to General Mark Clark, a blood relative who commanded U.S. troops during the Italian campaign in World War II? Or perhaps was this connected to his father's thwarted ambition? Having attended a military academy and been promoted as far as second lieutenant in World War I, but never sent overseas, this was something his father, Julian Hillman, so desired that more than 20 years later he re-enlisted as soon as World War II broke out. He became Major Hillman during America's occupation of post-war Germany. The martial style was not the only ancestral carryover. We might say that Rabbi Krauskopf's Jewish reform movement had the same central theme of repairing the world as his grandson's archetypal psychology. We might see one grandmother's flamboyance in Hillman's lecture performances, the other grandmother's school teaching in his academic calling. As he grew up in the Atlantic City hotel world, it was noteworthy when the poet Robert Bly, a longtime friend of Hillman's, without any prompting, said in an interview with me, "My first impression of Jim was of someone who came from a line of very good innkeepers. I saw him as host at a hotel that served wonderful food, had great rooms, and the feeling that you were always welcome. He's standing behind the desk, checking you out, and he's going to do things for you. I mean, the room service is superb." The practice of honoring ancestors dates back to the earliest known societies, when oral history narratives of clan or tribe traced roots back to gods, animal totems, and legendary heroes. Genealogy had played a crucial role in rights to royal lineage and the begats of the Old Testament. Various gods and goddesses lived within the ancient family. The ancient home gave plenty of space to the invisibles, Hillman wrote. Plato's Republic used the word daimon to describe a soul companion that guides us during our time on earth. Hillman would devote an entire book, The Soul's Code, to the idea of the daimon, saying only if a member of the natural family, itself not always determinable, say a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt, is worthy enough, powerful enough, knowledgeable enough, may he or she become an ancestor in the sense of a guardian spirit. This in itself was not new to psychology. Jung's idea of the collective unconscious grew from the notion of primordial images passed congenitally from our ancestors. I feel very strongly that I'm under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by my parents and grandparents and more distant ancestors, Jung said in his autobiography-styled book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. It often seems, he went on, as if there was an impersonal karma within a family, which is passed on from parents to children. It's always seemed to me that I had to answer questions which fate had posed to my forefathers and which had not yet been answered. Hillman, while studying depth psychology at the Jung Institute in Zurich during the 1950s, had seemed compelled to learn all he could about his forebears. He wrote his parents, "I am grateful to you for thinking of me in connection with a box or boxes of personal papers of grandfathers. These things mean much to me." When his first book, Emotion, was published in 1960, Hillman dedicated it to the spirits of my grandfathers. As I say, framed portraits of his ancestors all hung together on a wall of an upstairs bedroom of Hillman's home in Connecticut, while in the attic were literally thousands of pages of material, reaching back 2 centuries. Letters and postcards, faded newspapers and photographs, genealogical charts. As a practicing clinician, I always asked about the patient's grandparents, about background, Hillman said in 2007. And when I give lectures, I say that they're more important than your parents. Have you thought about sitting down together for a dinner with your 8 great-grandparents? Would you be able to talk the same language, eat the same food? What would it be like trying to hold all that together? So as I say, I have a long chapter about the ancestors in the book, which I hope you would find of interest. They were all quite remarkable people. And Hillman said at one point about his rabbi grandfather, who he never knew, died 3 years earlier, that the theme, the Krauskopfian theme, and when the grandfather died, I should say that, I mean, it was front page in the Philadelphia papers. I mean, it was a really big deal that Joseph Krauskopf had passed. And he was the leading Jewish Reform rabbi of his time. I mean, certainly one of the greats in all of America. I tell a lot of his story in this chapter. And the theme of repairing the world was one that Hillman later in life became aware applied to him. He said, when I say I do therapy of ideas, it's to repair bad ideas, broken ideas, forgotten ideas. That's an indirect way of restoring or repairing the world, though it isn't necessarily by social action. Also, the very idea that the world is broken, alienated from its source, although I don't follow the Jewish idea that its source is in God, but that it has fallen away from its archetypal and mythical sources or foundations. So the book goes on from the Legacies of the Ancestors chapter to get into Hillman's coming of age in the war years. And he goes off to, well, he makes some trips to Mexico and even to El Salvador, where, you know, he's always doing outrageous, wonderful things, you know, kind of, I mean, he spent time with the ruthless dictator of Salvador at the time. I mean, you know, he traveled all over Mexico, just, you know, in those days you could do that. And then he went to, after he graduated from high school, he went to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. and that's where he became more, at the time he wanted to be a writer, and but he didn't even know that yet. He was studying philosophy, and he then left. The war came along, and Pearl Harbor, of course, and then his parents were stationed overseas eventually. He really wanted to go in the service, and but they rejected him as far as going overseas because of his eyesight, which was so bad. But he ended up having an experience that framed the rest of his life, which was he became, in the latter stages of the war, he went into the Navy in '44, and then in '45, after the war ended, he was an attendant to blind soldiers who had been in POW camps in Japan. And we talked about this at some length, and it was quite incredible. I think I will read you some of this, and then we'll take a short break. Because this gets into his letters from the time, which were so poignant, I thought. On March 14th of 1945, so that's the war ended. War in Europe ended on May 1st. The war in Japan that August. Hillman penned this letter to his family. For the first time, I am conscious of the war in a real way, not the news maps, because he'd also been he worked for a radio station in Washington, D.C. While he was at Georgetown. Not the news maps, Technicolor movies, or glorified magazine articles, but in the stark truth of actual personal perception. Oh yes, there is occupational therapy and movies and tickets, this is with the men that he was taking care of, and various programs and medals, but of what use a medal to the chest if the sleeve be empty? Think of all the wonderful things you love and then think of never being able to see them again. Think of your favorite place to walk, then think of going there on crutches with your pants leg pinned up for your leg is no longer than your thigh. These were also maimed soldiers who'd come back that he was working with. He said, these men are conscious, very, very conscious of war. They well know the results of war on treasuries, for they've seen its waste, on land and buildings, for they've seen its destruction, and on men, for they have seen death. Many who have been in uniform since they became 17 know only one trade, death and destruction. These are our future citizens, and yet in spite of their vast knowledge of war, they know nothing of war's causes. They know not why they are maimed, that this must never happen again. He wrote in another letter, that was summer, July 9th, 1945, tomorrow we go to the home of Mrs. Teddy Roosevelt Jr. at Oyster Bay. This is when he was a teacher attendant stationed in New York at the city's Institute for the Blind. And he would engage the men in sports and take them occasionally to these parties in the suburbs. He said, but perhaps it would be a bit more apropos to tell you more of what it is like to be working with blind people. Young men like me, who were drafted as I was, but who were sent overseas and were hit and crippled for the rest of their long lives. I can never get the thought out of my mind that it might be I who was being led instead of leading. They've all had so little in their lives prior to this tragedy. They're young and naive, and there's so much in New York that cannot be described to them, for these are things they do not have in Alabama or Oklahoma. At night, when we lie on our sacks and it is dark for all of us, I forget that these men are different from all others, and that there will be no morning light for them. And during the day, when we're cussing, swapping jokes, talking of women, etc., I forget again, until one will come in from shining his shoes and ask in a humble voice, as if he did not want to trouble me, Jim, are these shoes shined okay? It's then that it cuts most deeply. It's then that the sweeping wave of sorrow and pity hits me, and I could cry if I were not so darned inhibited. It's difficult to reconcile two viewpoints. First, that we're supposed to treat them completely as normal people, maintain the same degree of discipline and never spoil them with favors. Second is my own inward feeling. When they ask me for something, who am I who have had so much and who am so completely whole to deny them who have so little left? Everything in their lives is a problem now. Nothing can be done with grace or facility. Everything must be worked through and thought out. Everyday living is fraught with frustrations and minor irritations. It's only through secondhand impressions from others that they're able to relive the street scenes of life or repicture the riot of color that is nature. It's then that I try my best to reshape and remold the visions I get of things into a pattern more clear-cut for their minds. How do I like it? I love it. I know I'm doing good, and that in itself would be satisfying. Beyond that, though, I have a certain selfish interest, for I'm broadening my mind, my soul, and my understanding. Experience like this is a dredging, which plows up and makes deeper my whole being. Perhaps you would rather hear of how we feed the men or how we walk with them, or how we teach them to sit down or dial a phone or keep their wallets in order. But all that is so minor and uninteresting and does not cover the problem of understanding at all. Doing that would be like describing a poem by telling of the rhyme, pattern, and meter and not of what the poet is saying. Maybe I've made all this sound a little heartrending or mournful. I'm sorry if I did, for the men are not that way at all. They're full of fun and life and humor, all of which is especially pathetic to me. However, I hope I've made all of you realize that you must be thankful. I don't know to whom or to what, that you are as you are and you have what you have. The solitude of winters in Atlantic City, the lonely room at Georgetown University, and now this experience in the Navy hospital. Therapeutic initiation, expressed in a youthful voice, but with a daimonic eloquence. He wrote his mother early in 1946. A patient returned from surgery and nearly died. I was quite worried as I was at his bedside, holding his mouth open for breath and depressing his tongue. It is most unreal. You feel so completely useless. Amid broken men came the beginnings of what he would one day describe as a soul-centered therapy. May 2006, more than 60 years later. We are sitting in the living room of his large haphazard house in Connecticut, where Hillman lives with his wife, Margot McLean. She's in New York today. We're alone, except for the 3 cats and outside the cackling of chickens. Several boxes of old letters surround us, brought down from the 3rd floor attic. I read aloud to him from the letter quoted above. There was a long silence afterward before Hillman speaks. I had no recollection of that letter, absolutely none. Another pause. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war with Japan was over in August 45, he remembers, but now we had a whole new rehabilitation, not of the immediate war wounded, but of prisoners of war. Navy personnel had been captured by the Japanese and over several years in POW camps been so undernourished that they lost their eyesight. I ran a sort of talking book library, all these books on heavy 78 RPM records. So the guys, if they wanted, could listen to a book. They could do this in what were called quiet rooms, just off the ward, where also a Braille teacher would come in and somebody else to teach piano. I spent a lot of time alone in those rooms, reading, writing poetry, and listening to music. In some way, I was trying to work through it all psychologically, the whole war. I felt more and more identified with the patients, so I moved from the barracks right into the ward and lived with them, which wasn't allowed. I think that's where I first felt therapeutic, the calling. And it tied in also with being revolutionary, against the officers, against the hospital system, against the treatment, the rehabilitation ideas. Reintegration into American life was on the most superficial level imaginable. They'd be all dressed up in their uniforms and we'd take them on special trips for our boys. To a nightclub or an elegant party out on Long Island or the New York Athletic Club for dinner. We'd ask the guys to stand up, guys with scars on their faces they can't see, and they'd get them drunk. Everything you want, have a steak, anything you want. All this entertainment as therapy. I felt it was awful. I didn't know how to handle it. I just felt the insult of it, the lack of depth in it, the treatment of diversion, cheerfulness, upbeat, all of that. I believe that set me on the road to revolution. And out of that came the recognition of how important depression is. This was a kind of key to what became a major theme of my work afterwards, that depression is fundamentally a way into the soul. I knew many of them very well. I'm thinking of different ones. Bucky Gerwig was a kid my age. He was all scarred. He had jungle rot. There was no medicine for it, and he just disintegrated. He was a very brave kid with this. He eventually committed suicide, I was told. Who else? I still remember their names: Stokes, Bishop, Carver, Thaler. Thaler was a boy from Iowa who was blinded, and he had operations on his face. I'd wheel him into surgery and stay there. I remember he began to choke on the way back on a gurney, and I opened up his throat somehow. Another silence descends. These guys were fundamentally alienated now. That's a conflict that comes up in my life after this, that I'm somehow always an expatriate. The alienation, my moving from the barracks into that ward and sleeping there the last 3 or 4 months I was in the service, perhaps that was my first period of exile. I close the chapter with this quote from Interviews in 1983. But something wanted to go into it more deeply, and the only way to go in deeper was to go in closer. In a culture where there are no deep ideas, no structures of depth. I was already caught up in psychotherapy at 19, even if I didn't know the word. Why don't we take a break on that note? Thank you.
As you're sitting down, and I want to point out that if any of you are enjoying these incredible and lovely alchemical paintings by Penny Dinsmore, a longstanding member of the Archive for Research in Archetypal Symbolism Committee, ERAS, San Francisco, they are actually all that have not been sold for sale, and the sale will benefit the Archive for Research in Archetypal Symbolism, something that I think is relevant to James Hillman's work as well.
Thank you. Hope you're all finding the talk interesting, and well, you stuck around, so I guess you are. Go till 12, or we can go a little after. I will do some more talking and reading, and then I want to leave time for questions. And so, if you we'll do that at the end. But whatever you'd like to ask me, I think, feel free. And I'm going to skip. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'll skip ahead because. So what happens after the war is that James ends up going for the first time to Europe. Europe has been huge in his consciousness his whole life. His mother's gone there many times, and his family has the George Cinque Hotel, but he's never been there until 1946, and they sail across, and he ends up in Germany as a correspondent for in occupied Germany after the war, where his father is stationed, and he ends up writing a column for this paper, sort of newspaper, army newspaper in Frankfurt, Germany. And he travels all over the place. He covers the beginning of the United Nations. He's, this plane that goes down and with a bunch of people missing in the Alps, and he's just rich with experiences that he has, and it was the Armed Forces Network. And then he decides to go to school in 1947 at the Sorbonne in Paris. And he travels there, falls in love with Paris. It's the heyday again. He's always in these scenes where something is going on in the larger mass consciousness, if you want to call it that. And so he's there in the heyday of existentialism. He's living right in this area, the left bank, where Jean-Paul Sartre comes, to the cafe every day, and he passes by Simone de Beauvoir at the table, and he's there. I mean, he one day he writes to his parents. He says, little Truman Capote was in the cafe floor the other day. He said, "It's true, his voice is so high only dogs can hear it." So he runs into this, all these people. He didn't meet Mailer, but Mailer was over there, and George Plimpton starts the Paris Review. I mean, it's this rich period. And for James, at this other cafe called Le Tabou, he meets his future wife, who is this gorgeous young lady from Sweden. Kate Kempe was her name, and he sees this girl walk in with this guy that he knows already, who's a Dane, I think, or Sweden, and as soon as that guy, and he's just sees this girl, and he said nothing like that has ever been seen, and she really was unbelievable. And so as soon as his friend goes into the men's room, James goes over and introduces himself. He always had a lot of chutzpah that way, and he asks her out on a date, and they go, and they end up. Then he goes through different periods of he has these other girlfriends, but he's very serious. Something is very serious between the two of them. But then he goes off to Dublin after Paris to attend Trinity College, where he majors in philosophy. He's getting a master's in philosophy, and also he's very interested in becoming more so in psychology. I'm not going to read you this part because I'm going to run out of time, I think. But well, no, actually maybe this part I will if I can find it, because he's early on when he's in Dublin, he suddenly starts suffering this chest problem, and it turns out that he's got tuberculosis, and so he goes to this sanitarium in Lausanne, and I'll read you just a little bit about that, because it was, again, a very formative thing for him after his experience with the blind soldiers. He suddenly himself, suffering from TB, and in those days the antibiotics for TB had just been developed, so he's going to live, but some of the young people who were there, it's too far gone for them to survive it. So in 2010, Hillman would reflect, like the Naval Hospital, I was immersed into pathologizing and tragedy. Young people dying. I somehow literaturized it as I wrote poetry and listened to music at the Naval Hospital. In Lausanne, I lived the high standard of Swiss hospitalization, well protected, but it was macabre. I never felt or believed I would die. Puer immortalism. It was the others who were dying and being ruthlessly operated on, etc. The puer complex feels immortal. But for Hillman, the mark lingered. In his early 80s, he would be diagnosed with lung cancer in the very same place on his right lung that the tuberculosis had weakened. Called by Thomas Mann, he says this, in the Magic Mountain, La Petite Tache Humide, little moist spot, struck me as a debt I still owe to the puer aeternus, who is an archetype that continues even into old age. I got away once at 22, but the spot still lingered in the body. The debt still to be paid, even at age 83. As if to say, gifts come from that figure, the puer, but so does death. The sanatorium stay marked the first time that Hillman began to write down his dreams and ponder their meaning. To his friend Wesley Heiler, he wrote, I dream about and have been dreaming about for 2 months, jungles, rivers, water in all shapes, snakes. Twice about fighting wars, at least 5 other times about being again in the Navy or wearing uniforms, always uniforms. I understand such dreams of swimming the rivers of India in which are shiny little snakes last night. I don't get the significance of uniforms, although the martial nature, as we now see, was very much at work. Another letter, this one to his parents, recounted, my nights are spent busily dreaming. The other night I was in some sort of classroom in which they were discussing the value of fresh air in the treatment of disease. The teacher asked what diseases are cured by air. I put up my hand and replied, claustrophobia and asphyxiation. When the laughter of the classroom subsided, mine too, even in my sleep, I raised my hand again and added, drowning. He also says he read some more of Jung. Where he touched me was with the idea of individuation, that there was a process going on that one could trust. It became like a mystique of believing in my own fate. So he goes to Trinity College, gets out of the sanatorium, returns to Trinity College in Dublin, meets J.P. Donlevy, the future famous novelist. They have a great friendship. I remember interviewing a friend that he made then named Doug Wilson, who he met at Trinity, who was there then. He was an American. I interviewed Doug in Connecticut. He's gone now too, but he remembered this professor. Hillman would sit right there in the front row of his philosophy class, and one day the professor looks down at Hillman and he says, "Take the odd note, Hillman," because James would never write anything down, right? So I love that story. Of course, also Hillman was a big aficionado of James Joyce, so he found back in those days, Ulysses was banned. Nobody could. It was considered pornographic, and it wasn't until I think 1960 that it became available. But he got a copy in Paris and just loved it, and read Finnegan's Wake. And so when he first moved to Dublin, he actually made a point of going outside of the main area where the college was and getting a place that looked out upon the Martello Tower that Joyce had made famous in Ulysses. So he just wanted to be there and absorb these amazing people. Then he became involved while he was in Dublin with a magazine called Envoy, which was a literary magazine, and James was one of the first editors of it. Dunleavy was connected to it. It was started by a guy named John Ryan. I write a lot in this. I have 2 chapters on Dublin in the book, and write a lot about this. In fact, it was Hillman, interestingly, who this is before this gentleman was famous, but this short story came in from this relatively unknown Irish writer. And Hillman decided, well, we'll publish it in Envoy, and well, the writer turned out to be Samuel Beckett. So, you know, he had a pretty good eye for these kind of people. And when he graduates then from Dublin, from Trinity College, and Dunleavy told me this story of how many years later they went for his graduation party. His father took he and his friends, Wilson and Dunleavy and all among them, to a place called Jamais, which was this kind of fabulous place to eat in Dublin. And years later, they got together. They were talking on the phone one day, and Dunleavy and Hillman, and according to Dunleavy, suddenly there was this silence on the phone where they was remembering Jamais, and Hillman was weeping on the other end of the phone, you know, remembering that incredible parting from, because he had a real strong affinity for the Irish, and they used to go to these pubs, and he knew Patrick Kavanagh, the poet, our famous Irish poet, and Brendan Behan. You know, all these guys were there at this time, and they used to go to the pubs. And Hillman said that you know they'd end up getting in fights, but Hillman says, I was never a fighter. I held the coats. So, which is kind of envision that. So then they after he graduates, he takes off now with Kate, who goes back and forth on whether she hadn't seen him all that much while he was at Trinity College, so they weren't married yet. But they make this incredible trip together to first to Africa along with Wilson, and they stay in the Mahdi's palace in the Sudan, and then they travel into East Africa, where Hillman first really gets a feeling for the animal, you know, the wild animal, which came to be, there's a whole volume of his uniform edition about animals, and he did this marvelous book with Margot McLean called Dream Animals, and she did the drawings, and he went through all. Later he had an animal dream group, and when he was first in Zurich as director of studies. So the importance of the animal, I think, was really brought to the fore in when he first went to Africa. But he went back all the way to as a kid. He used to play animal lotto, and these themes were always present in his life. You know, a real soul's code story. I mean, the acorn. And so then from oh yeah, I'll read you this one little part about the animal since I'm talking about it. If there was any single thing that Hillman took away from Africa, one that would remain a lifelong theme in his work, it was the importance of the animal. As a boy, he collected stamps of African animals, played animal lotto. Now in Africa, he'd seen them firsthand, and they fired his imagination. Jung in East Africa, who wrote at the time, touched only by the breath of a primeval world, felt then, this is Jung saying, as if I were the first man, the first creature to know what all this is, because Jung had been to Africa 25 years before Hillman. That was about witnessing and consciousness, whereas for Hillman it was about imagining differently. He would later write, "We need the animals," says Lawrence Vanderpost, "because animals are reflections of ourselves. We can't know ourselves unless we see ourselves reflected in them." So from there, Hillman doesn't know quite what to do. He's kind of like me when I traveled around the world for a year and a half too, and went to some of the same places he had been to in Africa. I never got to India though, but he decided to make this trip to India, where he was going to really become a writer. He was going to work on the great American novel, and which was his dream at the time. And his novel, by the way, still that he wrote then still exists, and it's at the Pacifica Graduate Institute archive, and it's again a sort of a foreshadowing of who he became later on. If any of you want to do some research there, and I write about it in the book. But India was extremely significant for him. He's not someone who went east in the sense of Ginsberg and Richard Alpert, who became Baba Ramdas. You know, all these. There were many seekers going to India at that time, and Hillman lived with Kate as if they were married, although they weren't yet, in a little village in Srinagar in Kashmir, which is I've later found out a very significant place. Some people say that Jesus didn't die on the cross. He survived, and he ended up buried in this town, Srinagar, where Hillman ends up years later. I mean, it's kind of strange. I'm making no more of it than that, but here's a really interesting thing that happened toward the end. And it's a meeting that Hillman had with an Indian guru or mystic named Gopi Krishna. And I'm going to read you some of this because it really sort of brings us up to how he gets to Zurich. And as it was recounted by a fellow named Tontaine Hauptmann, who was an astrologer who taught Hillman's son Lawrence astrology, and Lawrence became an astrologer in his later years, and that's what he does today. And it was Tontaine who first introduced him to that as kind of in a mentoring role when in the 1950s, or 60s actually, because they remained good friends. And Tontaine Hauptmann had met Hillman and Kate in Kashmir. He was just traveling. He was from Switzerland. And as he recalled in some autobiographical tapes recorded in 1997, it was Hillman who said to him one day, "There's a guy in the bazaar who writes poetry in languages he never knew. He's a Kashmiri Brahmin. I have an appointment with him. Do you want to come along?" Hillman wrote in a psychological commentary to the book Kundalini, The Evolutionary Energy in Man, published in '67. We had come upon the work of Gopi Krishna at a local fair, where a pamphlet of his poetry and a brief account of his experiences was distributed by one of his followers. So in whatever way the subject was first introduced, whether by Hillman or Hauptmann, one very hot day toward the end of June 1952, James and Kate, accompanied by his writer acquaintance Gerald Hanley and by Hauptmann, went to see Gopi Krishna, who lived with his wife in a modest home within the busy bazaar. Hillman later recounted, "I went on the visit out of curiosity, skeptically, critically, expecting a mountebank, ready to argue, disprove, and later perhaps laugh. I recall the heat, the flies, and my shirt stuck with sweat to the back of an old leather armchair. He sat on a cot, reposed, round-bodied, in white, smiling. The look of his skin looked different from others I'd met during the past year in Kashmir. Then I thought he looked healthy. Now I might say he glowed. I remember the simplicity in which our conversation took place. Above all, I remember the eyes of the man, friendly, luminous, huge, softly focused. They attracted and held my attention and somehow convinced me that what was happening in this room and with this man was genuine." Gopi Krishna had been born in 1903 in a small village about 20 miles from Srinagar and lived most of his life in the Kashmir Valley. Always an avid reader, he'd learned English as a teenager. He explained to his Western visitors that he'd begun practicing meditation at 17 after failing an examination to enter college. Having developed an ability to sit for hours in concentration without discomfort, he was in his mid-20s and visualizing an imaginary lotus in full bloom radiating light at the crown of his head when, suddenly with a roar like that of a waterfall, I felt a stream of liquid light entering my body my brain through the spinal cord. He next felt himself slipping out of his body, completely enveloped in a halo, and soon was inside a vast circle of consciousness in which the body was but a point, bathed in light and in a state of exaltation and happiness impossible to describe. However, the initial euphoric experience had soon turned into one of constant torment after he desired to repeat it again and forced things. This led to about 6 weeks of hell, in which he thought he was going mad or dying. The moment my head touched the pillow, a large tongue of flame sped across the spine into the interior of my head. Repeatedly over the next dozen years, he struggled to stabilize his consciousness. The phenomenon of superphysical energy that had seized him is known in the yogic tradition as Kundalini. This is a Sanskrit term for the primal energy of human consciousness, represented in the form of a serpent coiled around the spine. When awakened inadvertently or through ritual practices, it is believed to unwind across the various chakras or energy centers of the body. Gopi Krishna's experience led him to believe that our brains are evolving and that his experience foretold for humanity the emergence of a consciousness of the transcendental type. Hillman would remember Gopi Krishna telling about the Kundalini rising and about how these various languages came to him. He could speak in 15 different languages. Then he said something about the spirit. And I, in my American practical side, said how spirit emerges from the body, and the body produces the mind, which is more or less squeezed out of the brain. Your basic Western material scientific thinking. Well, this shook him. He almost went into a trance, it shook him so much. Spirit or Kundalini did not emerge from the body, said Gopi Krishna. Rather, it could be understood as an internal biological mechanism, and it was responsible for creativity, genius, psychic abilities, religions, and mystical experiences, and certain kinds of aberrant mental states. At the time, Hillman found Gopi Krishna's response a fantastic idea, revelatory. This was a big moment for me, that somebody could think the opposite of the Western approach. Not that I'm choosing between 2 points of view, but it was an important relativization of my point of view, which I had simply assumed. And this actually turned out to be so close to the theory of Neoplatonism in Ficino, a Renaissance philosopher, that it did in fact still bear upon my later thinking. It was as if it rang a bell that was in my own philosophy, but hadn't been awakened. Hillman went to see Gopi Krishna again for talks before he departed Kashmir. So then one afternoon I was over at the place in the heat, Jesus, tremendous heat, and I was sitting on this sticky chair with flies all around. Hillman told him that he and Kate were planning a pony trek into the Himalayas, as high as 14,000 feet. And he remembered Gopi Krishna telling him, go high in the mountains. That's very good to go high in the mountains, because that's where man meets God. In 1967, Hillman wrote, because unusual events occurred to me in the high mountains after meeting with Gopi Krishna, I tend to regard him as an initiator and a signal person in my life. Our meeting went deeper than I then realized. His eyes first led me to trust my own sight, my own convictions, beyond my trained, skeptical Western mind. This was itself an initiation into actual psychological work, which I only later took up. Well, I'm not going to tell you what happened in the mountains. It took him a long time to talk about it. He didn't want to talk about it. But it's in the book, and you can. So, and this next part was hard to talk about too, because they went from the Himalayas to the cold, severe atmosphere of Stockholm, where they're going to get married. They finally decided they're going to get married. And it would be 5 years into the interviews for this book before Hillman could bring himself to describe what happened immediately before, during, and after the wedding. So he said, Kate's boyfriend was still around, former boyfriend was still around. And he was an anthroposophist in belief. That's a system based on Steiner. Before she went off to Africa with me, she'd been moving towards his spiritualism. Kate's mother was also involved, and I think her younger sister, Tony, sort of. It wasn't a big deal, but it was there, this world that Kate had left behind. 3 days before the wedding, my family was about to arrive, and I realized Kate had gone off to see her former boyfriend. In Hillman's Notes on Calling to Psyche, which he wrote for me in 2010, he added, back in Kate's room in the flat where she grew up, a day before the wedding, and in the midst of so much external trappings and duties, we were on the bed talking of him and her feelings, and I must have felt as if she was cutting out or all was collapsing. Suddenly I felt lifted off the bed. I had the sensation of extreme heat in the sacrum. Starting from the base of the spine came an upward movement, all the way up the back of my neck to the scalp. My voice shot up high, my scalp stiffened and rolled back, pulling my eyes up, lifting the eye sockets. It almost knocked me out. I was terrified. What happened is I had the Kundalini experience, but at once damped that idea down. I wanted no part of it. For the next day and a half, I was in that state. My eyes strained wide, my scalp pulled back. I went through the motions of everything, but I was not quite physically present. Just before the actual wedding, dressed in complete formal frock, I remember feeling sick and went to the bathroom. I was on the floor, my head against the cool toilet bowl, thinking I was going to vomit. I remember looking in the mirror and seeing another face, a demonic face, like a possession. I held on to the wedding. I wanted it. I believe we both did. The gold wedding rings we'd had made said inside, all shall be well in both. But it was all a tremendous strain for Kate, who looked absolutely beautiful. She had a fantastic dress, and it was a wonderful ceremony. We knelt on the altar. There are some pictures of me at the wedding where my eyes are way up in the back of my head. It was a feeling in my whole body that I was going to go, or was, out of my mind. I was performing everything properly, but that was the inner feeling. I don't remember who was my best man or Kate's maid of honor. Basically, I was alone. I should have had one of my friends from Dublin or my brother as a best man, but nobody came. So I was very unattached and unsupported, which contributed to what was happening to me. So it's from that they go and stay with Tante and Hoffman, their friend who'd been there with Gopi Krishna, in not far from Zurich. And Tontaine has a pamphlet about the Jung Institute. So Hillman thinks, okay, he's a mess. He feels like, you know, he needs something for his psyche. He's having a breakdown, or had a breakdown, you know, at the wedding, and he's got to sort some things out. So that's how they end up at the Jung Institute. He goes and he doesn't intend to stay. He thinks, you know, in fact, he goes to the first class, and it's taught by Rivka Scharf-Kugler, I think, and and he thinks, oh boy, he leaves that. He says, this is not for me. He wants, so he's going to go back to India at that point, and continue his novel, but he doesn't, and he's sitting there getting ready to go back, and he ends up canceling their reservations, and so he enrolls in 1953 at the Jung Institute, and you know, he I'll read you this little part. When the moment came for Hillman to present himself to Jung, because Jung is sort of retired at this time, he's not teaching courses at the Institute, but a lot of really great people are. I mean, all kinds of the Jungian Marie-Louise von Franz, who'd been with Jung for years, and Eliade, the great Romanian mythologist. I mean, many fascinating people are there that Hillman's taking courses from. But when it comes to the time for him to present himself to Jung, he chooses an unusual way to do so. Toward the end of February 1954, Hillman wrote to his parents of a forthcoming pre-Lenten carnival similar to Mardi Gras. Fastnacht is this weekend, and the Institute is giving a party in the oldest guild hall in Zurich. We're going in costumes, and I have been working on a skit for the last few days. The skit, he said, would be a satire of our institute and the lecturers and all the jargon of our brand of psychology. A precocious, even wicked sense of humor was nothing new for Hillman. As a boy, in a skit he wrote and performed for his family, he lampooned his parents. This is Dad, as you can see. Since he's been married, he's never been free. Mother is a main factor, for she is a fine actor. Now for the Fastnacht in Zurich, the guild hall at the Zunfthausmesse with its elegant French-style decor and parquet floor was full by early evening. Jung and his wife were in attendance. So were all of the Institute's instructors and their spouses. On stage, Hillman played the part of a naive young American applicant looking to study there. The prospective student wonders about where they keep the maze for the rats and the differential personality projective techniques. While instead there are a resident alchemist, several astrologers, and a course in the I Ching. And for fairy tales, we are the last word, the Institute's tour guide explains. Yes, the place suited everybody except 19th century materialists. As for the courses, they bore names like Earthly Mysteries of the Lower Eros. There was a free colloquia by various lady lecturers called Reflections on My Analysis with Dr. Jung. The visitor then proceeds to meet with the various professors, all of whom are lampooned further. Toward the end, he is asked, will you pay in gold? Professor Jung always needs gold for his alchemy tricks. From the audience, at various intervals through the skit, Hillman could hear a laugh, both Olympian and intensely human at the same time, as Lawrence Vanderpost once described it. Yes, it was Jung. The old man, as Hillman referred to him in a letter, never stopped laughing, which set the tone for the rest and made the evening a roaring success. So then, this is late in 1955. I'm going to give you some of the pictures of Jung and Hillman because I think you'll enjoy them. Came the celebration of Jung's 80th birthday. There were to be 3 major gatherings, all at the Dolder Grand Hotel, including a small select dinner for those connected with the Institute, teachers as well as students. Dear Mother, Hillman wrote afterward, we had lots of excitement in Zurich for Jung's 80th birthday with a big international reception and then a boat ride on the lake with him and with his disciples and associates from all over the world. And then some of us went to his house a few days before the birthday to give him a present. Jung's house in Kusnacht was about a half hour from Zurich along the main Seestrasse that runs through the various shoreline communities. Down a long villa-edged road, passing through white gates at the end of a short avenue of trees, stood an imposing but dignified house built along the lake in early Baroque style. Over its front doorway was a quote from Erasmus that Jung had had carved into the stone. Vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderit. Whether called or not, God will be present. Hillman and the others passed through a large entrance hall and were ushered up a gracefully curving staircase into Jung's spacious library with its parquet and Indian carpet. It was here that he customarily saw his patients. The picture window looked out upon extensive gardens leading toward a lakeside boathouse where Jung moored his sailboat and rowboat. The students took afternoon tea with Jung. Their present was a little mimeographed book collecting all their dreams in which Jung appeared. The idea, according to Hillman, was to give him an indication of how his image was appearing in us who didn't know him. In other words, the manifestation of Jung as a psychic figure in the psyches of his students. In one of Hillman's dreams, Jung had appeared as an old alchemist in a tower, working with salt. It would still be some years before Hillman embarked on his own study of alchemy and learned that the salt crystal forms either as a cube or square and is completely solid and non-flammable. Thus, salt in alchemy represents stability and is called the principle of fixation. More than once did Hillman dream about salt during those early days in Zurich, and long afterward he would write an entire essay about the element. Of that dream, he came to believe it was as if Jung, or Jungian psychology, was going to keep me solid or get me fixed, because I was both volatile and inflammable. I might otherwise catch fire. So his father dies while he is in Zurich, and again, he has this, the night of his father's death, he and Kate had traveled to Basel to witness that city's famous Fastnacht parade. They rented a hotel room overlooking the main square. Then at 4 o'clock in the morning, the bands accompanied masked performers in costume, all marching through the streets with torches. When Hillman finally fell asleep, a series of nightmares began. He recalled years later, I don't remember the dreams, but there were 8 of them, mixed with the drumming going on in the streets, all tremendously violent and powerful, a kind of riot of the underworld. When we got back to Zurich the next day, there was the telegram about my father. Could his father's death, an easygoing but rather passionless man, have freed Hillman in some respect? In Greek mythology, Dionysus is the liberator of inhibitions, and he presides over communication between the living and the dead. Already in writing about emotion, Hillman was in a sense seeking to recover something of the Dionysian spirit. And Dionysian themes would remain an important element in both his later writing and the festival-like atmosphere of gatherings that he held for friends. He meets with Jung for the first time privately on April 12, 1956, at the house overlooking the lake, which happens to be Hillman's 30th birthday. But he doesn't know whether Jung knew that that was true or not. So they sit there and they hang out, and Hillman is thinking about his thesis for the Institute and doing it on time and types. And I'm just going to read you this one part because it's an active imagination. That Hillman, this was also in the archive at Pacifica, that he conceives this imaginative dialogue between the two of them. It's kind of neat. So it's sort of like, you know, you get this in the Red Book with Jung talking to his soul, which is S, and then Jung. I'm actually reading the whole Red Book right now, which I'm finding incredible. So I, meaning Hillman, look, what you both don't understand is that when I live in the garden, the house, my wife, and so on, I don't write my thesis. I don't get bright ideas. My piece of work is something important. It's a sacrifice to have to waste time. Jung, all I can say is if you only knew how much time I wasted and how fruitful that time was. The fruit on the tree is only there a few weeks of the year. The rest of the time the tree is growing, withering, and so on. Winter is half the year, night is half the day. I can't understand why you must want such an unnatural amount of fruit, of daylight. I accept night, but only because it furthers day. I'm impatient for it to be over. Jung, it is a sin against creation. It is a question of living closer to emotional time. Jung, now you come to the reason why this section of your thesis, the crux of your original contribution, you've decided to leave out. Emotion is time. Each moment is structured in a rhythm. The time we make with our minds is arbitrary and rigid. If you lived emotional time, the time to sleep, the time to eat, the time to waste, and the time to work feverishly, then you would be living, be healthy, and be happy. Around the time of his first visit with Jung, there occurred what Hillman remembered as an absolutely crucial moment. He was walking from the trolley stop, up the road past the zoo, toward the house that his family had recently moved into, when there came a sudden flash of realization. For several years, as part of his analysis, Hillman had been writing down his dreams and their interpretations, as well as dialogues of active imagination with imaginal figures like the one above. He'd also embarked on preparations for writing his thesis, but in his mind, this was not creative writing in the sense of doing short stories or a novel as he'd tried in the past. That seemed to Hillman a separate path from the one he was pursuing in psychology and philosophy. But as he walked up the hill, in a burst of insight that he would never forget, it came to him. There was really no separation at all. I could be a psychology writer. Beyond merely the academic, I could do books. Because, up to that point, he used to dream about Dunleavy all the time. By then, Dunleavy was started, he published The Ginger Man, and so Dunleavy represented the figure, the writer in his psyche, and he used to have all these dreams about him. But now that kind of broke. He realized that he could do it. So he's also attending the University of Zurich at this time, getting his degree in philosophy, and that's where he's doing his thesis on emotion, which became his first book. And so he graduates from the university, and then they have this party at the Hillman's home by the zoo, and they'd had the ceremony at the university and just had time to change their clothes before the first of some 30 guests arrived. The roses were in bloom. Little Julia and Carla, his children, had flower wreaths around their heads and gave out a little corsage to each guest. About 50 years later, Rima Spiegelman, Marvin Spiegelman's wife, they were students there at the time, would remember the two little girls in white carrying baskets of raspberries or strawberries to put in the champagne. In a postcard he sent to David Hart, who'd graduated magna cum laude and was by then practicing psychology back in the U.S., Hillman wrote, "Boom, summa cum laude." And to Dunleavy, James wrote, "Done. After the sweatbox of exams, I am done. Big deal, as they knighted me with a summons cum lewdly." So Hillman graduates from the Jung Institute then in '59, and he creates a position at the Institute, which was called Director of Studies. And he makes it up out of whole cloth. But part of his work was he wanted to bring Jung to a much wider audience. And he said he comes back from a trip to America, a fundraising trip, and when he goes to see Jung in the spring of 1960, we were out in his garden, and a little plane went over making a lot of noise, and he observed heavenly farts. He was probably doing what we call an indirection. That is, he was bringing the conversation down, putting me back in my shoes. Hillman followed up the visit with a letter. "I want to thank you warmly for the hour you gave me a week ago Saturday. It left me with two impressions, one of a simple, pleasant beauty, and the other a feeling of strength and confidence and energy. These two impressions seemed so irrational and unintellectual that I doubted a bit and criticized myself and the hour. But now that a bit more time has passed, I see that the results were deeply positive on an emotional level. It meant much to me to hear from your own lips that you were interested in the Institute and its future. I was also glad to have had the chance to thank you personally for your great contribution to my life and that of my family. There's a lot of work to be done here, and somehow as a consequence of our hour, I feel much more like doing it and find I have more energy for it." So then in June of 1961, Hillman is director of studies when Jung dies at the age of 85. Hillman, at this point, has been doing some studies of parapsychology. Back then they called it ESP, extrasensory perception. And besides C.A. Meyer, who was his analyst and who was involved in some of this work, he was in touch with a very famous medium of the time named Eileen Garrett. And he wrote to her when Jung died, "His death is a shaking event. I shall tell you some ESP tales." One of these being the story of the lightning that came and struck Jung's favorite tree around the same time that he died. But that wasn't all that Hillman was referring to. As director of studies, Hillman was regarded as enough a part of Jung's inner circle that he was invited to come to the house when the body was still lying in state. He brought with him a beautiful white lily. I don't remember whether I decided to take white lilies because I'd seen them in the alchemy books or because they're a kind of anima flower. But I remember Yolanda Jacobi, who was one of Jung's people, brought red roses, and she made a down-putting remark to me, in effect saying that I was the weak anima man bringing white lilies, and she was bringing the passion of red roses. Then I was able to go alone into the room where Jung's body lay. At the time, there weren't many others present in the house, and they were all sitting in the adjoining room looking at family photographs. Standing beside the coffin, gazing down at the man who had changed his life and whose legacy he now sought to carry forward, Hillman remembered, "I don't know to this day whether I had an experience whereby it was his voice telling me, or whether this was an idea or dream or fantasy or imagination that I had. But it was somehow as if he said, 'Don't weep or mourn,' or 'Don't be in this kind of lily state. Get out and work for me.' So I had the sense that there was a job for me to do." In 2011, Hillman elaborated, "Of course, I took this idea of a job to do in an extroverted, worldly manner. Only all these years later do I realize that the real work was the soul work." So Jung is gone. The old guard of the Jung Institute remains. Hillman has a lot of problems with them. They have a lot of problems with him. They feel like he's, for one thing, he's American. He's introducing all these, he's bringing all these lecturers in from the outside. He's not worshipful of Jung as they were, although obviously he has tremendous respect for the man. This I thought was interesting. He's on a lecture tour in 1963. He's met Adolf Guggenbuhl Craig, whom I'm sure some of you have read his work as well, and they make a lecture tour together to America in the autumn of 1963, and so they're in the United States on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, when Hillman is supposed to give an evening talk on the negative emotions. He remembered being in the midst of lunch with Adolf at one of those lobster places on the wharf there in Boston, when word came that President Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. Surviving in Hillman's archive is a prefatory note that he wrote that afternoon, but then decided against saying, although his lecture went ahead as scheduled that night. "This is a difficult evening," the note said. "We are in the midst of a revolution in this country. The shadow is in full view, and we cannot get rid of evil by blaming the radical right or the black Muslims or the mafia or Castro and the communists, or, as Eisenhower did this afternoon, call evil psychopathic. The destructive force of which Dr. Guggenbuhl spoke on Monday and Tuesday evenings is made very clear by the events of this afternoon. With such suddenness and reality, destructive evil strikes. Assassination, murder, and war, too, begin this way. This revolution is not just outside us in the streets and jails and detention homes and clinics or in Dallas, Texas, but is the shadow in each of us that is trying to come out. And the point of this lecture this evening, and of all these lectures, and of analytical psychology, is to make a contribution to the major problem of our day, confrontation with the dark side of ourselves." So I thought that was quite amazing, and interesting that he's addressing this in particular on the day that President Kennedy is assassinated. And he says basically about the Jungian hierarchy that he's up against at the Institute. He said to me one day, "You see, these people are all pupils of Jung's and all rivals for his love, his attention, his affection, and he wasn't a loving man. And then after 1961, he was dead. The old flesh had its system. They each knew who the other was. The Jungian second generation had been fighting each other for years. And here I was, absolutely outside of that. My presence was a thorn in their side. I was by nature arrogant, like the Aries is. But I also felt myself to be a leader or a revolutionary," going back again to his experience in World War II. "I want to change this place, make things happen in the midst of a really destructive atmosphere." It also grated on the dogmatic Institute types that Hillman didn't believe in Jung's ideas, but rather found them valuable because they're so good to work with and against. To a fellow to whom Hillman sent parts of his soon-to-be-published book, Suicide and the Soul, he wrote early in 1964, "I think there are two aspects of the process with traditional archetypal models. The one is the slow, steady climb up the ziggurat, the spiritual ascent, step by step. The other is the breakthrough, enlightenment, Zen. I have emphasized the latter at the expense of the former in this paper because I feel the Jungians hide behind the former in order to protect themselves at times and get caught by the patient's development notions and their own avoidances of the reality of decay, shadow, death. Had I been talking to LSD enthusiasts, which was just coming to the fore at that time, I would have talked against the breakthrough, the enlightenment, the momentary vision as a shortcut, and that patience and slowness and plodding the via longissima, longest road, is what's required." Hillman himself was a voyager along that via longissima. Suicide in the Soul was his first work that went into the underworld. As he wrote, italicizing the sentence for emphasis, "The issue is not for or against suicide, but what it means in the psyche." Thus did Hillman take up the question of life taking on its value through the reality of death. "Organic death has absolute power over life when death has not been allowed in life's midst," he wrote, and again italicized. Being willing to undergo a dying into life brought, in fact, a fresh and vital concern with essentials. As if his daimon required first the intellectual outpouring, however he might attune to that, and then the living out of his inquiry, Hillman, approaching his 40s and publication of Suicide in the Soul, reported in a letter to his friend Bob Stein, "The truth is that I'm barely standing. I take the experience in moments of detachment as death of the first half of life, and with it all the optimism, elan, phallicism, ego, and so on, in exchange for something which I can't formulate yet. I feel 40. And I think I will go on in this condition of sorrow and lameness until enough of the old me is dead." So we move on into a very painful, difficult period in Hillman's life, which we talked about at great length. And this was, first of all, the fact, and I'm not going to get into all this right now, I don't have time, but that his wife, Kate, had had an affair with their mutual analyst, C.A. Meyer, who was Jung's sort of heir apparent, had been, mentored by Jung, and Hillman found out about this and confronted Meyer about it, and he and Kate stayed together. She confirmed what had happened, what he had heard, and Hillman later, he told me, he said, "I remember going back to Meyer, and he brushed it aside in two ways. One being, oh, it was just short or something like that, which it wasn't, but meaning that it wasn't important. But secondly, implying that it was necessary to keep her in therapy or in transference or from going crazy. In other words, as if it hadn't been for that, maybe things would have been worse, some sort of justification like that." Later, Hillman added, "I was on the edge of physically hitting him, but I didn't. I wish I had." So then there comes a point where a section that I call Fateful Attraction in the book, where Hillman also, as a therapist, has an affair with a patient, and the woman's husband, they're from America, they're studying in Zurich. The affair goes on for a few months, and her husband finds a letter that Hillman wrote to her and goes on what can only be called a personal vendetta or crusade to get Hillman dismissed as director of studies at the Institute. And this takes up a lot of space in the book. I really get into it and what it taught Hillman, the agony it put him through, how Kate stood beside him actually through this entire time, and then of course I get into Meyer and who he was and how the guy was not only not a nice guy, I mean he was in some ways a pretty evil man, also a very good therapist. I mean, give him that. I mean, he was Hillman's therapist for years and taught him a great deal, and in that sense kind of a father figure to him. It was. And I also interviewed the people whom I do not name in the book, and I will not name here, but I found them. The couple was still alive. They still live together to this day, and I interviewed them both over the phone, and I told them I would change their names in the book, and I do. But it was a really, it was a huge time. I mean, it was, this went on, and the really unbelievable thing about it too was that Meyer teamed up with the husband to go after Hillman and try to get him dismissed as director of studies at the institute. I think to Meyer, Meyer was much older, of course, and Hillman was a threat, he was changing things at the institute. Meyer was part of the old guard, a fervent, Jung devotee, and so it was quite a time. And Hillman, when asked years later about what happened with, I call her B in the book, B-E-A, responded that it was a foolish affair. He said, "I'm sure I knew that I was tempting fate. When you consider reading life backwards," which he writes about in the Soul's Code, of course, "I think that unconsciously I had to fall, to have something terrible happen. I had to really sin to be initiated. It was a kind of violation or rupture with the professional code, one that put me among the big boys, Meyer, Jung, and other Zurich analysts who were my mentors and seniors. It was like a jump from the bridge, all the codes of practice violated. I could become disbarred, kicked out, tarred and feathered, as they say. Of course, in the moment, one does not think of any of that. But the temptation was much more than her. I think it was the symbolic importance of the initiation." So I don't see that really as he wasn't really trying to justify the affair. I mean, but he was seeing it as he always did in a kind of a bigger picture of something that he had to go through in terms of his view of what the soul is, in order to and of course, it was so hypocritical. I mean, Jung and Meyer had affairs with patients. I mean, and Meyer certainly, I guess, had been doing it for some time. Jung had Toni Wolff as his mistress for years, as well as his devoted wife, Emma Jung. So this was not uncommon in those days. And it was the 60s. There was a lot of this kind of acting out, if you want to call it that. I don't know. But yeah, in Zurich and all over the place. And so Hillman also at this time gets into he's invited to give lectures. Well, first he attends the Aranos gathering, which is this incredible place on Lake Maggiore which Jung had really helped initiate back in the 1930s. And Hillman then became invited to be one of the lecturers alongside people like Scholem and Adolf Portman, the great scholar about animal behavior, and Henri Corbin, the great scholar of Islam. Like Jewish mysticism and Islamic mysticism and all these things. It was like a gathering place for all these remarkable, but underground kind of scholars. Like Hillman was taking on new fields, new approaches to psychology, and that's what he was invited to talk about. And so he meets with people like Karenye to give his first lecture there. And he gives this kind of amazing talk. It wasn't a talk. It was a letter that he writes again to Stein. The thing about letters in those days was, God, they were just amazing. I mean, it's not like emails today where it's kind of quick and easy and for the most part. But he writes this letter to Stein, and he says, "What then is analysis? We come close to it when we regard it as an art, and compare ourselves to artists and to Henry Miller or Lawrence or Picasso or what have you. We look for our answers, don't we, in the life forms of people, how they live, how Jung lives, not just what they write or say. Hence the importance of gossip. We must know how to live analysis, how to live the anima, how to live the phallus. So analysis is to me now the place where the new life form is being created. The thing that goes on in analysis and tortures us all is the movement, creative movement in our declining culture, or a new life form. We analysts, to use an inflated term, the martyrs or victims of this new life form. As artists are victims of the creative drive that makes new art forms, and scientists are victims of what drives through them. The world does not and cannot understand what we are after. It is not a new morality that we're bringing as much as a new approach to life itself, a new way of living it, and this threatens the old. We cannot look back at how others did it. There is no real Vorbild model, no real viable image for how to be. The artist does not have to be conscious of what he goes through, and the older analysts seem to be conscious without going through. Even in practice, they could always run to Jung for protection. We must believe that we are on the forefront, fingertips of this thrust. 569. So he gives this essay at Eranos on Eros, and I'm going to skip most of this except to tell you that what he is eventually, the way the book ends is he is forced out, as he's in America at the time, teaching at the University of Chicago in the fall of 1968, and everything comes to a head in Zurich, and a lot of the old guard who've already turned against him now enlist more people from the patrons of the Institute, and basically Hillman is out as director of studies. There's a lawsuit going on at the time. The husband of the woman he'd had an affair with is suing him in the courts in Zurich. He might end up being kicked out of Zurich entirely. He doesn't know. He's nervous about going back to America because he thinks he could be served with a subpoena here. I mean, it's a really, really rough period in his life. And but then he says, he gets this letter of kicking him out, basically. And he said, I submitted because I had two choices: to fight for the job and maybe lose and get thrown out, or at least use up vast energy and involve all sorts of people, or to resign, wait the 6 more months until my 10 years are up since working began here, and play safe. I chose the latter, but mainly because inside the moment the crisis was over of the decision, I felt superb, and I felt great relief. He capitalizes that. At last, I can not only give up practice for a while, which I had planned, but also the business work over there and having to see people whom I dislike for the sake of the work. Now I'm on my own for the first time in 10 years. And it's at this point where he goes to London. And I get into this a lot more in volume 2. But he goes to visit the Warburg Institute, where he had read that portions of the Eranos collection of symbolic or archetypal images were housed. And one day he finds himself alone in the Warburg Library. Here were all the images of antiquity, of the mythic figures and the philosophers, all gathered in one place. A giant vault of psychic archaeology, he would recall. Perhaps a dig would reveal a buried tradition on which psychology and psychotherapy could build a different approach from the medical scientific and its terminology. The gods and goddesses of antiquity were each cataloged, and as Hillman opened the drawers and perused the images of Aphrodite and Apollo, Hestia and Hermes, he felt something mysterious happening inside him. It didn't happen all at once, as some overwhelming visionary experience, rather the dawning realization that there was a trove of occult knowledge buried here. There were texts associated with the images, obscure authors from the Renaissance era whom he'd never heard of before. One of these was Marsilio Ficino, a loveless, humpbacked, melancholy teacher and translator who lived in Florence, Hillman would later write. Translator and reformulator of Plato, Plotinus, and the Corpus Hermeticum. Ficino's reading of ancient philosophy provided an incentive to plumb the depths of one's own soul so that the whole world may become clearer in the inner light. A way of seeing that had deeply influenced Michelangelo, among others. Ficino's ideas had spread through Renaissance Europe, then gone underground with the advent of the rationalists and the Enlightenment, and now they reverberated in Hillman across the centuries as though he'd found an ancestral brother. He had the overwhelming feeling that something was beginning and something was over. He wrote in a letter to Kate that setting foot in the Warburg, he'd had very powerful experiences, and I'm more and more sure that I've got my new direction. It's a matter now of organizing my major ideas together like a biography of the mind, getting the main thoughts into major order and that I can live with for a long time. Mythology and psychology and my own psychopathy all go together. He reflected in 2007. Looking back, much of what I had been floundering around with in this lecture or that seminar were pieces that the Warburg pulled together into a single tradition. And that is what I was searching for. A tradition prior to Jung and Freud, which could found the work, and which was a tradition in which soul was the central trope. This marked the beginning of what Hillman would come to call archetypal psychology. My ideas in the interrelation of psychology and mythology fill me with joy, he wrote Stein not long after returning from London. And as he put it to Marvin Spiegelman, as the tumultuous decade of the 60s drew toward a close, I feel way out on a branch, and I like it there very much. So that's where volume 1 ends, and volume 2 picks up, which I have been working on, with the story of Pat Berry and how she earlier had come to Zurich and been a student of Hillman's at the Institute and gone into analysis with him, and eventually, not when she was in analysis with him, but afterward they became lovers, and eventually got married. So Pat is a big part of volume 2, and as she should be. They were married for 20 years, together for 20 years, and so volume 2 picks up with that story of the beginning of archetypal psychology and the spring publications, which James came to be the editor of and took over in 1970, and then on through Spring House, where they had these amazing meetings with Rafael Lopez Pedraza, and they would just, everybody would come and they'd drink wine, and a lot of the future Jungian or post, archetypal psychologists came out of there, Kapuscinskis and Paul Kugler, and some really amazing people. And they all would get there and kick around these ideas about the memory theater of Don Camillo, and just marvelous stuff that would go on into the wee hours as they all get a little bit drunk, and so that story is all in volume 2, and as well as a lot more. And then the Terry lectures, giving those at Yale in 1972, and so I'm working on it. I've done altogether, I think, I did chapters before on the men's groups and on his time in Dallas. So now I'm back into the early Zurich period and writing, or not that the early Zurich period, but the period after he's out as director of studies and he's still living in Zurich. So I've written maybe, I don't know, a third of the book, maybe. I'm still not sure exactly when it's going to come out because I keep getting sidetracked with other projects. But I did want to share with you before I take questions just a little bit of the personal story of what James gave me in terms of my relationship with my son. And I guess, again, since I said it best probably in the book, My Mysterious Son, I'll read you just this little part. So I had gone up to see him. He talked to me early on. I wrote down a single line that penetrated deep into my psyche, and he'd said, "Even your solicitude is confining to him," Hillman said. My son had been diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was 17, and I was going through a tough time with him at this particular point in time. And I was visiting him one day, and Hillman, we were driving along. I remember going to lunch somewhere, and he'd immediately tuned into my sadness, and he looks at me and says, "So you've been having a hard time with your son?" So I brought him up to date on what was going on, and he said, he proceeded to speak of how as years went by, the intensity of schizophrenia lessened, but the personality diminished at the same time. Basically, he meant that people afflicted with the disease often don't grow emotionally beyond their first breakdown. Hillman didn't necessarily buy into schizophrenia being strictly genetic. He spoke of how mysterious the disease is, that doctors don't really know what causes us or what medications will work best, coupled with the fact that it strikes most all of its victims in their late teens. He seemed to be indicating that there is a sole choice involved by the individual so afflicted. By the end of September 2004, Franklin's back in a group home. He'd been in and out of hospitals for quite a while, and so I go up to see Hillman for the biography, and I raise a question with him that I've been wrestling with, and it concerns the delusions, so-called, that my son had been experiencing, which persist despite his taking medication. And I explain that one fantasy of his is that I am not his father, even though Frank sometimes concedes that I did raise him. He clearly doesn't want to be who he is. He takes on substitute identities like the reincarnation of Tutankhamun or Bruce Lee. So what do I do in the face of this? Do I accept the delusions? Do I challenge them over time? Or do I simply listen and try to figure out what my son might really be expressing underneath? My tape recorder is running as Hillman responds. You listed the choices already. I am your father is one way to do it. Another way is you enter the delusion with him. The main aim is to maintain a conversation, I would think, to keep connected with him. He's testing you. I don't mean in an oppositional way, but just unconditional acceptance of whatever, because you really can't change anything. The tendency is to treat everything as if it's acute, but you need to accept the fact that a chronic condition is different. You have to realize that it's Chronos, the god of time. You don't look for improvement. It's really walking along with. It's accompanying, without any end in sight. Accepting what is, and just going along, and talking with him. Also about things you want to talk with him about. This is a very important part about what you've been doing or thinking. Maybe he doesn't want to hear it, but that doesn't matter. The point is that you're not there out of guilt and fatherhood and all that, but you're talking to him as a human being. Your normalcy is helpful because nobody he talks to is normal. They all talk to him about being a sick person. I interject that I'd like to be able to tell my son, when you took this particular medication, you were able to go to school, or maybe we could write a book together someday, but we can't do it if you're delusional. But then Frank immediately starts arguing with me. Hillman continues, well, again, you probably have to reconstellate the relationship, not in terms of where you're trying to help him, and not trying to get anywhere with him. Simply, you know where I was today? I went to Connecticut. You let go of his being a sick man. Then you may find he tells you things that he doesn't talk about otherwise. You don't know what's going to come out, but it's almost as if you've abandoned being the responsible father because you can't move him. Okay, so that's over with. Make him feel that you really want to see him and tell him things. You say, this guy drove by and I thought, I wish Frank had seen that car. What do you think of that kind of car? He might go into a delusion about the car, but it doesn't matter. You've approached him differently from the therapeutic. I interject again, and differently from my expectations of Franklin. Exactly. It's something that's not your world and not his world, like in the sense of writing a book together, or his world without his medicines, hospitals, and all that. It becomes like sitting in a bar together, side by side, talking about the day. Yes, I reply, he'd like to write, he says he'd like to write his book, not with me. Exactly. This whole thing with the therapy, he's been inoculated. He doesn't want that. It drives you crazy. That's the last person I would want to see. I used to ask people, what does going crazy mean to you? Does it mean you're going to lay around with your clothes off or shoot somebody? The other question is, where do you want to be? On an island with no phone, curled up in a room in the dark? Who do you want to talk to? People don't want to see therapists. They really don't. They want to go to a bar, find a lover. All I mean is, I think the most useful thing is to get around all that clinical area that in a way he draws you into, the delusions. Does it do any good, I wonder, for me to try to figure out where the delusions come from? Hillman shakes his head. Very mysterious, he says. So I heeded that advice. I just stopped trying to correct my son, put him in my box, make him, be correct in terms of what he said. And once I did that, everything changed between us. We'd go to a Chinese restaurant. There was one in Boston area we used to like to go to called Chef Chow's, and he'd start talking to the waiter one day it was Chinese, in an invented Chinese language. Well, the waiter looked kind of nonplussed by this, and so at one point he goes by again, and Franklin beckons to him. He says, don't worry. He says, I'm talking to you in Cantonese, but he, meaning me, only understands Mandarin. So we laughed. I mean, it was hysterically funny, and I didn't care. I didn't care what the waiter thought, or we came to enjoy each other's company, and it's a long story. I mean, I tell the story in My Mysterious Son and then other things. It was weird. It was like Franklin was not only I found amazingly psychic, but he could tune into things about Hillman, which I want to share a couple of these with you. He said, at lunch, I told Frank about being in New York over the weekend and seeing James Hillman, who was at the time very ill. Right, he said. He wrote the human genome. I paused a moment and I said, well, no, actually he wrote the soul's code. Franklin says, well, that's what I mean. So I told him he was just way out ahead of me. as usual. Then one day we're driving back to his house, and Franklin, he's into astrology, interestingly, and he was actually, as a teenager, brilliant at astrology, and he could memorize everybody's chart in our big family. And so he looks at me and he says, you know, your real birthday is April 12th. Now he has no conscious idea this is James Hillman's birthday, and he says, you're in Aries, Neptune in Cancer. So, you know, this is exactly the aspects that James Hillman has in his chart, and he's never even looked at it. But it's like he's tuning into this relationship I have, and it was quite marvelous. And then, very strange. Before Hillman died, well, actually, when he died, they had his. I went to his funeral in Connecticut, and then my wife and I went back to L.A. and I get a call from Franklin's house, and I'm told that he was feeling suicidal, and he had called one of the workers there into his room to say that he needed to go into the hospital, that he was confused and he was hearing voices from people telling him to do things, including a lot of dead people, and talking about how he could be burned and people could use the ashes. And this comes completely out of the blue, and he's been taking his medication. So, you know, he's somehow, again, tuning into this underworld. At least I felt that way. And I remember James telling me, I had decided at this point, this was toward the end of 2011, to take Franklin to East Africa, because the family pediatrician that was remained a very close friend, had been Franklin's pediatrician when he was a boy, had been born and raised in Tanzania and Kenya, and his parents were missionaries, and he lived there all of his growing up years, and he would go back. He was now in his mid-70s, and he would go back and make an annual pilgrimage and take people to see the wildlife migration. And so he invited me, and he knew Franklin's condition and everything, but he said, you know, I've had somebody cancel out. Do you want to come on the trip? So I talked to Franklin about it. At first he was a little scared, but he said yes, he wanted to do it. So, and I remember James Hillman saying to me about maybe a month before he died, he said, you know, even if something happens and you can't make the trip, he said, that's okay. He said, because the important thing is that he was able to imagine going, which I thought was quite wonderful. When we did go, and I don't have time to get into everything that happened on that trip. I will say it was profound. There was a night, maybe in the questions I can get into some of this, but there was a night toward the end of the trip when I didn't realize my son had been mixing up his meds, which he was taking, and we were one night he was so far out there that I didn't know. I thought, geez, making this trip was a terrible mistake, because my son is biracial. He was in a black culture for the first time. I thought he'd absorbed way too much of the African unconscious somehow, and that I mean, he was all over. He was back in the past. He was into the future. It was mystical, metaphysical, incredible. I sat in a chair. It sounds cold, and it was, I guess, but I sat in a chair across the room, and I just wrote down this monologue that he went into for like an hour. And I didn't know if I could get him back from this experience. I will tell you the rest of the story, because it's not that long. But I think that this was partly, you know, things that I had learned in the process of getting to know James Hillman were very helpful in this. But I didn't know what to do. I remember at the monologue ran down, and it was dinner time up at the lodge, and I wanted him to come up with me for dinner, and he didn't want to do it. I remember at the end of it, there was this cry outside the room, like this, sounded like a banshee, but I'm sure it was a big bird of some kind. But I mean, it was like there was this tremendous cathartic release somehow that had happened. And so I went up to dinner, and he said he'd stay in the room, and the room was called Chatu, which translates serpent, by the way. And I went up to dinner, and I told the doctor, the pediatrician, what was going on. He said, was he going to be all right in the room? And I said, I think so. You know, yeah, he'll be okay. And he said he wouldn't leave the room. And so we sat down to dinner, and our African guide, who was a Maasai, was the same age as my son, and they got along famously, because in that culture, he didn't make judgments. I mean, Franklin could say kind of strange or what might be considered off-the-wall things, and Stefan would just take it in. You know, it was fine. They talked back and forth, and I remember Stefan, I told him a little bit of what was going on, and he just looked at me and he said, "Oh, he's a good man. He's a good man." And I thought for a minute, well, should I take him down there to the room with me and maybe he could help? And then I thought, no, whatever I got to do it myself. So I went back to the room and I had somebody bring down a plate of food. Came in with a plate of food and they put it down on the table, and Franklin said, I told you, I'm not hungry. The genie filled me. So I said, well, did you take your medication? He said, yeah. He said, no, but I will. So he did. And then he went back and lay down on the bed again and kind of looked up at the canopy, and he was starting to go into this riff again. And I didn't know what to do. So I just lost it. I just started pouring my heart out to him, telling him, you know, how much this trip meant to me, that we had all this time together in a way that we hadn't since he was small, and it's just us, and things that had happened when he was a boy that I regretted and wished hadn't happened, and I don't even know all the things I said, and I just poured my heart out to him, and all of a sudden he looks up at me and he says, "You're crying." I said, "Oh, gee, maybe so." He says, "Are you having a breakdown?" I said, "Could be, Franklin, I don't know." I said, he says, "Well, maybe you're the one who should be hospitalized." So suddenly he was back in this 3D reality. The roles were reversed. He was like the father, and I was like the little kid, and then, you know, it changed everything. I mean, it was remarkable, and I realized later, then, you know, then he still didn't want to eat, and the plate of food was over there, and I remember at the end of that night, we were going to go to bed, and I turned off the lights, and suddenly he bounds out of bed and goes over and eats the plate of food. And I said I waited till he was done, and I just said, "Well, I hope it was still warm." He said, "It was." And I realized later that there was this, that he was able to feel me in a way that I often wouldn't let happen. You know, I was the writer, you know, I was taking him on this trip, I was sitting in the chair writing things down, and you know, but he knew that I loved him and that I was going through a lot of agony over what was happening. And the rest of that trip, he was a prince. I mean, we got up the next morning, he says, "Can I make your box lunch for you?" I said, "Sure." And then we're riding along the Land Rover, and he's holding my notebook so I can write more steadily, taking notes on what's going on. And it was an amazing night. I consider it a real breakthrough, which then led to other breakthroughs. And again, you know, it was the Hillman presence is always there. And the man that I ended up going to see in search of not a complete alternative to medication, but an adjunct that might help my son in his life, was a man named Malidoma Somé, who was a shaman from West Africa who had been involved in the men's groups, and whom I first interviewed over the phone about James some years before that. And I ended up contacting him and going to see him in Ojai, and for a divination about Franklin, and then I took Franklin to meet him in Jamaica, and they hit it off. I mean, it was pretty amazing, and Malidoma did some work in whatever this mysterious way is that shamans work. And all I can say is that today, I think Frank's doing better than he has in many, many years, and he's doing school, and, you know, he's not cured, you know, that's not the point. But I think he gained self-confidence, being able to make that trip. And Malidoma told me, after sitting with my son, who does a lot of art, he just did drawings for Malidoma of these kind of mysterious hieroglyphic characters that he's kind of channels from somewhere. I don't know. I mean, I can't claim to understand my son, but he's quite amazing, and he's a very talented artist, musician, writer. A lot of his writings are in the new book. I went to see Malidoma after Franklin saw him in Jamaica, and Malidoma says, "Oh," he says, "your son has my head spinning." he said it was like meeting a colleague, and, you know, and then we proceeded to talk further. But so anyway, we went on this pretty amazing journey, if that's the right word. I particularly like that word, but together, and it's still going on. And you know, one of the places I took Franklin to was New Mexico, where again a man named Pat Toomey, whom James had known in Dallas, and I had met there, put us up for several days and took us to all the sacred places of New Mexico. So that's about as much as I got time to tell you, but I'm ready to take some questions for another 10, 15 minutes, if whatever you'd like to ask.
I also have a microphone up here, so if you guys could just wait to ask your questions, then I can run over and grab you the mic. Thank you.
In addition to all the amazing stories of his life, I'm wondering, in the second book, there's a lot of amazing stories that happened around his death. In terms of, I know Michael Meade had a dream around that time, and Jeanette Perry's experience around trying to get there before he died. Are you going to take some of those things, which then are kind of like stories as he moves into being an ancestor,
Yep.
as a part of book 2?
I hope so. Yeah, I mean, I definitely will write about his, you know, I was there for the funeral. I was there with him a lot in the last months. You know, James really did not like the idea of mysticism or, you know, quote, spirituality, all these things. And yet, I mean, he was obviously a very spiritual man, with his emphasis on the soul. And in his later years, reading the Red Book and talking about it, sometimes with Sonu Shamdasani, really changed his perspective on who Jung was. And I want to get into that too. I mean, he felt suddenly, he said once that, you know, because there were some of the Jungian ideas about the self and the ego and so on that he didn't really care much for. He wanted to move into another place, and he realized that so much of what he had done, he himself had done in his writing, was really carrying on what Jung had set down in the Red Book, and felt really close to him, and in a new kind of way. So, yeah, and you know what was odd about that funeral day? I don't know if any of you know this, but the winters in New England recently have been, oh boy, a lot of snow. Well, that winter was 2011, and it snowed that day on the end of October of 2011. It snowed a lot, and it was the only day it snowed all winter in New England. So I took that as, you know, kind of, I like mystical stuff. So anyway, I took it as a real, you know, it was a sign that someone of great stature was entering a different world, and I still dream about him. I miss him. I value who he was, and still is. Yes.
You mentioned that occasion in which Hillman had an insight that his creative writing, short stories, he'd written a novel, you alluded to that, was not so very different from the psychological writing, that he could be a psychological writer.
Right.
I just wondered if you wanted to offer anything about how that unfolded or manifested, or his relationship to that issue throughout, you know, the rest of his life, because he wrote very creatively, theoretically,
Yeah.
but he didn't write short stories, novels, but he was always, his psychology is profoundly related to the art. So how did that kind of interaction play out through the rest of his life? And
Well, I think it plays out in the fact that his works are so imaginative, most of them. Not just the ideas, but the way that he expresses those ideas, you know. And he says he used to have trouble with editors because he didn't necessarily write, you know, topic sentence and then, you know, and follow a logical narrative through to the end of a paragraph. He would sometimes invert it, or, you know, it's whatever. In other words, the creative process itself, much like a novelist or a poet, you know, he allowed reign, and I think he's the greatest writer psychology's ever had. I mean, you know, he had that novelistic gift, and he was able to then, you know, elucidate these new ideas in psychology in a book like Revisioning Psychology, which is, you know, just incredible. The way he frames it and his discourses into this and that, and you know, and he became, of course, in his later writings. Some of his writings, as we know, are harder to grasp than others, and but in later years he became much more of a layman's writer. I mean, he starting with the Soul's Code or even Kinds of Power, and then The Force of Character. You know, he was much more accessible, I think, to a general readership, which is great. I mean, you know, and I think he was always willing to change. You know, willing to take on new challenges, and he was interested in everything. I mean, he was great to talk to because his mind just, you know, ranged over all these subjects. And while he could be a very tough critic, or, you know, take people on in big ways, he occasionally, not too much, but I mean, he did with me, you know, kind of pushed me to a new place with the writing at one point. At one point, he was very worried I was getting way too far off the track, and I think I was. So, you know, I don't know if that answers your question, but he was just a very creative, imaginative guy, and not a scientific kind of writer. Yes.
The thing that I get from reading Hillman is that there's no subject,
Yeah.
even a single word that can't be explored. And he would pick up a single word and dive.
Yeah, dive deep with it. Like,
Yeah. And that's so inspiring to me as
Yeah.
a writer.
Oh yeah.
I think, wow, yeah, I can do some of that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. He said he never knew where he was going. I mean, you know, obviously you kind of outline your thoughts and everything, but he didn't know what was going to happen often in the next paragraph, which again is very much like a novelist who doesn't know for whom the characters, you know, dictate what he writes. I mean, you know, he's so involved in the character of the novel, a novelist, that they lead the way. And that's of course the great works, you know, that resonate with us most.
This may be in your Volume 2 book, but I'm wondering if you have any reflections or comments about how Hillman viewed his book, Revisioning Psychology and perhaps Dream in the Underworld. How was that received when it came out, and because for me that's the seminal piece of archetypal psychology that kind of starts it off, and I'm just wondering how he places that in the whole narrative.
I think he places those two books very highly. I mean,
was it well received when it came out?
Yeah. Well, Revisioning was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and Revisioning, as you probably know, was based on the Terry lectures that he gave at Yale. So basically, he turned those into a book, and at Yale in 1972, those lectures were, I mean, hugely attended, extraordinarily received, but not everybody. I mean, I remember Pat Berry telling me somebody took her to lunch one day, and who had been there at the lectures and was sort of part of the academic world at Yale, and said, you know, I'm a little worried about James Hillman's sanity. So, I mean, he would do things at the end of the lecture, you know, like he'd lie down on the floor. I mean, you know, and he'd speak from this position, lying down. I mean, he's, you know, whatever. But anyway, and that became Revisioning, which was very well received, as was Dream in the Underworld in terms of reviews. Yeah, I think that he was very, we talked about those books to some degree, and he was very proud of them, and knew that they were also challenging books for people for the general public perhaps to get.
How does a man like that view his, I guess in his later years, how did he view his love life and the affair? Like, is it critical? Was he judging himself, or just kind of, what was his sentiment about, you know, I guess he was married a few times.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, he looked upon all those women as having been, and more, as having been very important in his life, and he didn't, he didn't really express regret over the affair he had with the patient. You know, as he said, he felt like it was an initiation, and he did regret how it hurt Kate, and she died very young. I mean, well, in her early 50s. So they were long separated by that time. But you know, his 4 children were all with her, and so she was. And he never. What did he say at one point? She was always a huge part of his life. You know, I mean, in his dreams, everything. You know, she was. He didn't just move on from one woman to another. You know, he respected the fact that these were tremendously important relationships to him. And in fact, and I get into this in volume 2, one of his Eranos lectures in the late 60s was then called First Adam, Then Eve. And it's about, it was at the dawn of feminism and so-called women's liberation at the time. And he really was very, he was like an early defender of it. I mean, you know, some people didn't quite see it that way, but it really was. I mean, it was, Jeanette Perry told me that she thought it was the most important piece of work that any man had ever written about this emerging consciousness that was happening in 1970. So, you know, he loved women. He was very possessed at times by the anima, you know, and he was working that out and writing about it in his letters, and I don't know, like that.
There was a split in the Jungian analytic audience that followed the publication of Revisioning Psychology. Up until then, I and all the people I knew read every single thing James Hillman wrote, and he was the man they talked about. He and von Franz were the two we read. Then Revisioning Psychology came out, and a lot of analysts stopped reading Hillman at that point because they felt there were too many words and they couldn't figure out how to apply it. I myself reviewed The Dream in the Underworld when it came out, and I stayed on board. I'll never forget when I grasped the immense applicability of Hillman, which was when I was teaching the film Blue Velvet in this very room. And we had shown the film, as I did in those days, of start pioneering a way of teaching using film. We showed Blue Velvet, and I knew we were going to talk about it, and something was bothering me. I said, I don't get the insects. I get the ear, and I get the ants on the ear. What about those insects? And I thought to myself, you know, there's an essay by Hillman called Going Bugs. So I went up and didn't have my lunch. I went up and I pulled it out of the library and I read the essay. And there was an absolute description from a South American country's Lord of the Insects, in which Hillman precisely describes how the Lord of the Insects describes himself. And it's exactly the character of Frank, played by Dennis Hopper, when he puts on that mask to take the drug. He looks exactly like the insect. And there's the link, and there's the key to the film, that they are the insects, and it's the initiation by the Lord of the Insects. And there was Hillman, right on the image. Had not seen the film, didn't plan to apply it that way, but it's so specific and so practical.
Yeah, which I think was true of, you know, they're definitely his way of doing therapy. A lot of people just raved about what a great, incredible therapist he was, and from Pat Barry on, and he did it for 40 years and applied these principles that he had written about. I'm going to maybe take, I'm getting tired, but any quick further questions? Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.